Across history, powerful ideas and dangerous beliefs have often been written down, only to be hidden, banned, or buried. Some texts were sealed in tombs or caves, others locked away by priests, kings, or empires that feared what they contained. Centuries later, when they were finally unearthed, they revealed voices that had been silenced, fragments of lost knowledge that changed what we thought we knew about the ancient world. Gospel of Thomas, Nag Hammadi, Egypt 1945. Under the burning Egyptian sun, a farmer dug into the dry soil near a limestone cliff. His shovel struck something hollow. Inside the dust lay a tall clay jar, sealed tight. He hesitated to break it, fearing a spirit might be trapped inside, but curiosity won. When he cracked the seal, fragments of ancient papyrus peeked through the centuries of sand. What he had uncovered that day in 1945, near the village of Nag Hammadi, would change the study of early Christianity forever. Among the 13 leather-bound books hidden in that jar was a strange and forgotten gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the Gospels that made their way into the New Testament, this one contained no stories, no miracles, and no crucifixion. It was written entirely as a series of short sayings, 114 in total, each attributed to Jesus, but stripped of the familiar context. Some sounded like echoes of verses known from Matthew or Luke, but others spoke of secret knowledge, of finding the light within oneself. It began with a promise. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote them down. Whoever discovers the meaning of these words, it said, would not taste death. For nearly 2,000 years no one had seen a complete copy. Church fathers like Origen and Hippolytus once mentioned a Gospel of Thomas, but always with disdain. They called it the work of heretics, of those who thought salvation came from understanding hidden truths rather than faith or obedience. In the centuries that followed, bishops gathered councils to define which writings were acceptable and which were not. Thomas did not fit. It lacked the story of Christ's suffering and resurrection, the heart of the emerging Christian message. Instead, it spoke of an inward kingdom, a light hidden within the human spirit. One of its sayings reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." Another declares, "The kingdom of God is inside you, and it is outside you." For a church struggling to define unity and control, such words were dangerous. They placed divine authority not in priests or rituals, but in the self. It is easy to see why the text faded into silence. By the 4th century, when the canon of scripture was largely fixed, the Gospel of Thomas had vanished. Copies that still existed were likely hidden or destroyed, condemned as Gnostic, that is, as belonging to a movement that prized secret knowledge above doctrine. The copy discovered in 1945 was written in Coptic, the Egyptian form of Greek letters, and bound in leather that had turned dark with age. Scholars later determined it was a translation of an older Greek original, probably from the 2nd century. The pages had survived the dry desert air, folded together for 1,500 years, protected by chants and by the same secrecy that once kept it alive. At first, the manuscripts passed quietly through the hands of traders. Portions were sold, others hidden again. It took years before Egypt's Department of Antiquities secured the entire collection and brought it to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Only then could researchers begin to unroll, photograph, and transcribe the brittle pages. Each sheet had to be handled with surgical precision. Even the touch of a fingertip could make the ink flake away. When scholars compared the new text to a few Greek fragments already known from excavations at Oxyrhynchus, they realized they matched. The same sayings appeared word for word in some places, slightly different in others. That connection proved that the Gospel of Thomas had once circulated widely before disappearing. What survived in Coptic was not an isolated oddity, but a descendant of an early and long-lost stream of Christian thought. The content itself puzzled and fascinated those who read it. Some sayings seemed older than their counterparts in the canonical Gospels, perhaps preserving the raw oral traditions of Jesus' words before they were shaped into stories. Others reflected later interpretations steeped in mystical imagery. There was no narrative, no mention of sin, repentance, or judgment. Instead, it offered riddles. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me. Such lines suggested that the divine was not confined to heaven or to scripture, but hidden in the world around every listener. That vision was radical in its time. The early church fought hard against sects that challenged its authority. Some believed that Jesus' teachings had inner meanings accessible only to a spiritual elite. To preserve unity, church leaders drew lines. They labelled certain texts as dangerous, instructing believers to avoid them. Libraries in monasteries sometimes hid banned writings rather than destroy them outright. It is likely that monks living near Nag Hammadi, perhaps during the late 4th century, sealed these codices inside the jar and buried them for safety after new decrees ordered heretical books burned. If that was the case, the jar served as a time capsule of resistance, one that waited quietly for 15 centuries to be found. When the Gospel of Thomas finally reached translators in the mid-20th century, it caused debate that still continues. Some theologians saw in it an authentic glimpse into the earliest layers of Christian thought before doctrine hardened. Others dismissed it as a later Gnostic reinterpretation, too far removed from the historical Jesus. Yet, regardless of its origin, its rediscovery expanded the map of early Christianity. It revealed that the first followers of Jesus were not a single uniform group, but a mosaic of ideas, some eventually silenced, others preserved only by accident. The fragile codex that once lay buried in the Egyptian desert became a mirror of those forgotten voices. Through its cracked leather and faded ink, the words still whisper, "The kingdom is within you, and it is without you." It was a message powerful enough to be hidden, fragile enough to almost disappear, and enduring enough to survive 2,000 years of dust and silence. Pistis Sophia, Askew Codex, acquired 1772. In the late 18th century, a British physician named Anthony Askew spent his life collecting rare books and manuscripts. Among the thousands he gathered was a mysterious codex written in faded Coptic script, bound in brown leather and unlike anything in his collection. He bought it quietly and shelved it in his personal library, where it sat untouched for years. After Askew's death, his heirs sold his library to the British Museum. Inside one of the boxes, the curators found the codex again. The title on the first page read Pistis Sophia. It would take scholars more than a century to understand what they had. The codex contained one of the most complex and esoteric works of early Christian mysticism. It was not a gospel in the usual sense. There were no parables, no journeys, no crucifixion story. Instead, Pistis Sophia was a long dialogue between Jesus and his disciples after the resurrection, filled with cosmic hierarchies, hidden rituals, and strange hymns about the soul's fall and return to the realm of light. The name Pistis Sophia means faith wisdom. In the text, Sophia is a celestial being who descends from the higher realms, becomes trapped in chaos, and cries out for rescue. Her pleas for forgiveness and her gradual rise back to the light became a central image for the Gnostic idea of salvation, not through faith in the cross, but through knowledge and inner awakening. The manuscript found by Askew is the only surviving copy. It was written in Egypt, probably in the 3rd or 4th century, in the Sahidic dialect of Coptic. The writing changes halfway through, suggesting that at least 2 scribes worked on it. Scholars believe it was translated from a lost Greek original, since many words and phrases make more sense when reimagined in Greek, but no Greek copy has ever been found. The text itself is divided into several parts. The first 2 describe how Jesus, 11 years after his resurrection, teaches secret mysteries to his disciples. He speaks of the heavens as layered regions ruled by archons, angels, and emanations. He gives them passwords, seals, and names of divine powers that govern the soul's journey after death. Then the focus shifts to the lament of Sophia. She has fallen from her high place in the 13th realm of light, deceived by a false power. Her long series of repentant hymns, 42 in total, form the emotional core of the book. Each time she repents, hostile forces attack her. Each time a higher power intervenes. Later sections become almost instructional. Jesus explains how souls ascend through the spheres, how baptism and anointing work in the spiritual sense, and what punishments await those who do not possess the right knowledge. The writing is dense and ritualistic, filled with long lists of angelic names and cosmic titles. For centuries, Christian theologians considered such works dangerous, not because of immorality, but because they offered a map of salvation without the church. When the Codex reached London, few could read Coptic. It remained untouched in the museum for decades, catalogued but barely examined. Only in the 19th century did scholars begin translating it. The first complete English version appeared in 1896, prepared by the Theosophist G.R.S. Mead, who described it as a treasure of forgotten wisdom. Later, German scholars like Carl Schmidt produced more critical editions. Each translator struggled with the same problem. Many lines are damaged, words are uncertain, and because there is only one copy, there is no way to verify the original reading. Modern experts disagree on when and where the text was written. Some think it reflects Egyptian Gnostic communities active in the 2nd century, close to the ideas found in the Gospel of Thomas and the Apocryphon of John. Others date it later, perhaps the 4th or 5th century, when Gnostic thought was already fading under church suppression. The mixture of older and newer material suggests that Pistis Sophia may be a compilation of several writings stitched together over time. The Codex itself tells a story through its material. The parchment pages are about 20 centimeters tall, arranged in 2 columns. Ink varies in tone. In some places, the scribe stopped mid-sentence, leaving blank spaces as if uncertain. In others, corrections appear in the margin. A few leaves are missing entirely, leaving gaps that modern editors fill with cautious guesses. Each physical flaw becomes part of the text's mystery. The theology of Pistis Sophia is unlike anything in the New Testament. Here salvation depends on remembering one's true origin in the divine realm. Evil is not sin, but ignorance. The Saviour is a revealer who restores forgotten knowledge. Sophia's descent symbolises the soul's entrapment in matter. Her ascent mirrors the initiate's return through enlightenment. For the official church, such ideas threatened the message of faith and grace. By the time Orthodox Christianity dominated the Mediterranean world, texts like this were condemned and destroyed. Only hidden copies, buried or locked away in monasteries, survived. The Askew Codex was one of them. Its presence in Egypt fits with what later discoveries at Nag Hammadi confirmed, that Gnostic literature had once flourished there. The parallels between Pistis Sophia and those newly found works proved that it was not an isolated oddity, but part of a much larger spiritual movement. Even today, the book resists clear explanation. Some view it as the final echo of Gnosticism, written by a small sect trying to preserve its cosmology before it disappeared. Others see it as a synthesis of many traditions, Jewish, Christian, Egyptian, and Platonic, woven together by anonymous scribes. Whatever its origin, it offers a rare glimpse into the diversity of early spiritual thought, a world where faith and knowledge, myth and philosophy were still intertwined. In the quiet reading rooms of the British Library, the Pistis Sophia still rests under glass, its ink faded to a soft brown, its words preserved in silence. It speaks of beings of light, of forgotten wisdom, and of the yearning of a fallen soul to return home. A voice once hidden, once forbidden, still whispering through the centuries. Gospel of Mary, Berlin Codex, found in Egypt, published in 1955. The night was still in the deserts of Upper Egypt, and somewhere in a market in Cairo during the late 1800s, the hands of fate moved an ancient manuscript from oblivion into light. The codex known today as the Berlin Codex changed hands, crossing continents, while inside its leaves lay one of the most provocative Christian voices lost to time, the Gospel of Mary. This is not the Mary who gave birth to Jesus, it is Mary Magdalene, or at least a Mary figure given prophetic status in early Christian circles. The manuscript was purchased in Cairo in 1896 by a German scholar, Karl Reinhardt, who recognized the strange Coptic pages amid other papyri. He brought the codex to Berlin, where it eventually became part of the Papyrus Berolinensis collection, catalogued as 8502. The codex itself dates from the late 4th or early 5th century, written in the Sahidic dialect of Coptic. It contains 4 texts, the Gospel of Mary in fragmentary form, the Apocryphon of John, the Wisdom of Jesus Christ, and an epitome of the Acts of Peter. But the Gospel of Mary is the most controversial. It opens not at the beginning, but in the middle of a post-resurrection dialogue. The first 6 pages are missing. Another chunk, pages 11 through 14 is gone, so the narrative begins already in progress. What survives shows Jesus in conversation with his disciples. They ask about suffering, about sin, about the nature of matter, and about what happens after death. When the dialogue ends and the disciples sit stunned, Mary steps forward. Peter demands she speak, saying, "Sister, we know that the Saviour loved you more than the rest of women. Tell us the words of the Saviour which you remember." "Those you know, but we do not." Mary then recounts a vision, a revelation she received privately from Jesus, unseen by the others. In that vision, Mary describes how the soul must ascend through hostile powers, like gates that bar entry, each ruled by fear, by chaos, by confusion. The soul is questioned by those powers, asked, "Whose child are you? Whom do you serve?" Each answer, Mary says, allows further ascent. The revelation is dense with mythic symbols and spiritual names, far removed from the more familiar sayings of the canonical Gospels. But this speech by Mary does not go unchallenged. Andrew voices skepticism, saying, "I do not believe that the Saviour spoke this secretly to a woman." Peter objects more bluntly. Did he then speak privately with her and not openly to us? Are we to turn to her rather than to us when she reveals these things? Their objections echo the patriarchal tensions in early Christian authority, a debate not only about what was taught, but who had the right to teach. A third disciple, Levi, responds to Peter, "Peter, you always scoff at words like these. You do not understand that we must all become like Mary, to know truly the things of the Spirit, not the things of the flesh." This defense suggests what was at stake, a vision of Christian leadership not limited to male apostles, but open to female prophetic insight. Because the text is so fragmentary, critical gaps remain. We do not know how the revelation began, whose soul was being described, or how much further the dialogue extended. The ending breaks off while the disciples argue. What themes we glimpse, visions, ascent, powers, spiritual self-knowledge, disturb conventional Christian priorities. There is no emphasis on the cross, no recounting of Jesus' final days. Instead, the focus lies on inner revelation, on mastery over matter, on secret understanding accessible to those Mary could guide. Scholars often classify the Gospel of Mary as a Gnostic or proto-Gnostic text. Its view of sin is not rebellion against God, but ignorance. Salvation is self-realization, knowledge of one's origin, and a path through the barriers erected by cosmic powers. But it is not a classic Gnostic system. The text lacks a fully developed creation myth, or a malevolent demiurge in the way other Gnostic works do. Its tone is more intimate, more dialogic. Fragments of the Gospel of Mary also appeared later among Greek papyri. Two Greek pieces, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 3525 and Papyrus Rylands 463, carry parts of the text in earlier form, perhaps from the 3rd century. These Greek fragments confirm that the Gospel of Mary existed in Greek before translation into Coptic, but those fragments are small and do not fill the missing sections. The Berlin Codex remains our principal witness. Because Peter, Andrew and Levi are named, we can see the text dialogues with canonical tradition, but Mary's position threatens established authority. In a Christian era when orthodoxy sought to limit speculation, marginal voices like hers were squeezed out. Over centuries the text faded. Many communities suppressed such writings or quietly destroyed them. What survived did so in hidden corners until rediscovery in modern times. When translators at last worked on the Codex mid-20th century, they confronted damage, missing pages, ambiguous letters, corrections, scribal errors. Walter Till published a critical edition in 1955, finally bringing the Gospel of Mary to light. But from its fragmented state, every phrase became contested. Scholars debate which words should be restored, whether a variant reading better matches Greek analogues, whether gaps imply lines never written or simply lost to damage. Debates also swirl about dating. Some place composition in the 2nd century, others later. The dialogue's familiarity with canonical Gospels suggests a time when Christian communities already circulated alternative texts. Because of that, the Gospel of Mary cannot be tied to a single heresy era. It may reflect ongoing theological diversity. In modern scholarship, the text is often reclaimed. Mary Magdalene appears not as a proferal woman, but as a confidant and teacher. The Gospel of Mary challenges assumptions. Could a woman hold primary revelation? Could Christian knowledge be more than doctrine, more than ritual? That threat may explain why her text was hidden, dismissed, or excluded for centuries. The physical codex remains today in the National Museum in Berlin. Under careful conditions, its papyrus fibers rest in protective enclosures, its ink dim with age. In quiet rooms, paleographers examine the strokes. reconstruct letter forms, compare with Greek parallels, propose restorations. Every ambiguity in the text becomes a site of argument, a gatekeeper to what we think Mary really said. The story of the Gospel of Mary is not simple. It is a tale of lost voices, contested receptions, fragmentary survival, and the question itself of who speaks truth when canonical authority claims monopoly over revelation. Gospel of Peter, Achmim Fragment, 1886 or 1887. In the winter of 1886, French archaeologists working near the Egyptian town of Achmim entered a rock-cut tomb that had been sealed for centuries. Inside, among fragments of linen and the remains of a monk, they found a bundle of papyrus sheets wrapped in cloth. When the dust was brushed away, the pages revealed lines of faded Greek text, words that scholars would later identify as part of a long-lost early Christian gospel once mentioned by ancient bishops, a work thought to have disappeared forever, the Gospel of Peter. The find caused quiet excitement in academic circles. For nearly 1800 years, church fathers had warned against this very text. Serapion of Antioch, writing around 190 AD, said some Christians in Syria were using a Gospel of Peter, but that it contained false teachings. He read it, recognized traces of heresy, and banned it. From that time forward, the Gospel disappeared from sight. Its return from a tomb in Upper Egypt offered a rare glimpse into the variety of early Christian writings that official doctrine later erased. The Achmim manuscript is only a fragment. Roughly 60 verses survive, copied on parchment around the 8th or 9th century. It likely came from a much older Greek original, perhaps written in the 2nd century. The text begins abruptly, already in the middle of the Passion narrative. Jesus stands before Pilate, the trial is ending. Unlike the canonical Gospels, Pilate here plays no decisive role. The guilt for Jesus' death is shifted almost entirely to Herod and the Jewish authorities. The tone is sharper, the political message clearer. When the crucifixion begins, differences grow stronger. In this version, Jesus appears calm, almost untouched by pain. He cries out not, my God, why have you forsaken me?" but my power, you have forsaken me." That subtle change suggests a separation between the divine spirit and the human body, an idea known as docetism, the belief that Christ's physical suffering was only apparent. For later church leaders, that was enough to condemn the book as dangerous. The story continues with details found nowhere else. The cross itself is described as a living thing that speaks. After the tomb is sealed, soldiers guard it. At dawn, 2 radiant men descend from heaven, the stone rolls away by itself, and the men enter. Moments later they emerge supporting a third figure, Jesus, and behind them follows the cross, moving and speaking. A voice from heaven asks, "Have you preached to those who sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yes." The guards see it all, terrified. The women arrive later, find the tomb open, and flee. The text then breaks off mid-scene. The rest of the manuscript is missing. No other known gospel describes the resurrection like this. The image of a talking cross startled readers when the fragment was first published in 1892 by the Egyptologist Urbain Bourrion. Some scholars saw poetry in it, others myth. To defenders of orthodoxy, it confirmed why the early church had banned the work. The Achmim fragment was preserved by accident. The tomb in which it was found likely belonged to a monk who treasured the text privately. During later centuries, monastic libraries sometimes buried worn or forbidden manuscripts with their owners instead of destroying them. The dry climate of Upper Egypt acted as a natural vault, protecting papyrus and parchment far longer than they would have survived elsewhere. When the fragment reached Cairo and then Europe, it drew comparisons with other ancient finds. Some speculated that it might be linked to new pieces from Oxyrhynchus. Small Greek papyri later discovered that contained phrases similar to those in the Gospel of Peter. Whether those fragments come from the same book remains uncertain. No complete version has ever surfaced. The manuscript's condition adds to the mystery. Lines are broken, letters lost, pages torn. Editors can only guess at missing words by comparing them with parallels from the canonical Gospels. The parchment itself shows that at least 2 different hands worked on it, suggesting a copy made and recopied over time. Scholars place the original composition between 100 and 150 AD, one of the earliest surviving non-canonical Gospels. The fragment's theology reflects the diversity of early Christianity before a single orthodox line was fixed. Here Jesus' death is less a human tragedy than a divine event, his body more symbol than flesh. the resurrection becomes cosmic and mysterious, not witnessed by disciples but by soldiers in the heavens themselves. That difference explains why bishops like Serapion reacted so strongly. To preserve unity, the Church needed one passion story, one version of the cross. The Gospel of Peter offered another. After its discovery, the fragment's journey became uncertain again. The original pages eventually went missing, perhaps lost or misplaced in museum archives. Today, scholars rely on photographs and transcriptions made before the disappearance. Yet even in fragmentary form, the Akhmim find remains a vital witness to the shadow world of banned scriptures. Texts buried to be forgotten, but preserved long enough to remind us that early Christianity spoke in many voices, not just one. Temple Scroll, Qumran Cave 11, 1956. A sharp wind blew across the arid canyons near Qumran the day explorers pried open Cave 11 in 1956. Inside, among discarded jars and fragments of scrolls, they found a long, narrow parchment that would become known as the Temple Scroll. Buried for nearly 2 millennia, this legal treatise lay untouched, waiting for modern eyes to unlock its holy blueprint. The Temple Scroll is not a prophetic vision or lyrical psalm. It is a work of law, of sacred architecture and ritual design. Measuring over 8 meters in length in its best preserved copy, it presents itself as a divine revelation of how the temple ought to be built and how Israel should worship. This text describes an ideal temple, not exactly the one built by Solomon or Herod, but a perfected model, a new Torah, reshaping laws from Exodus and Deuteronomy, reorganized and expanded. The author rewrote or adapted many biblical laws, adding purity statutes, feast regulations, and detailed plans of the court, the chambers, the altars, and the inner sanctum. Because of its precise technical language, the scroll suggests its author was deeply familiar with temple ritual, priestly functions, and sacred geometry. It emphasizes an elevated role for the high priest and stricter purity restrictions than found in the canonical Pentateuch. In one passage, even sexual relations are forbidden for priests while they dwell in the sacred city. In another, there is a new festival structure: 4 first fruits celebrations, greater attention to offerings, renewed ordinances. The scroll rewrites the covenant, casting itself as a fresh revelation from God, a corrective to earlier imperfect laws. Though the prime manuscript comes from Cave 11, catalogued as 11Q19, other fragments from Cave 4, Cave 5 and other copies suggest the work circulated widely in the Second Temple period. Some fragments, notably 4Q 524, may predate the settlement at Qumran, hinting that the text originated earlier and was later adopted by sectarian communities. The scroll bears no sectarian labels or overt references to the Qumran sect. It does not use the community's unique names or sectarian language. That raises debate. Was this scroll a product of the Qumran community, or did it come from a broader priestly or Judean tradition? The physical preservation is remarkable. Parchment, not papyrus, was used, more durable in desert conditions. The ink is faded, tears and missing fragments abound, especially near the margins and corners. Editors restoring the scroll must fill gaps, guess letters, and compare variant readings across copies. Some columns are irreparably damaged. In the earliest years after discovery, one full-length copy was hidden beneath floorboards of a Bethlehem antiquities dealer for 11 years before coming to light. Only later did it reach the hands of archaeologists. After the scroll emerged publicly, the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin acquired it in 1967 and opened its content to scholarly study. The first full publication appeared in 1977. Since then, editors have debated date, authorship, and purpose. Paleography suggests the main copies were made at the end of the 1st century BCE or the turn of the era, though parts may date older. The overlapping fragments from different caves show slight textual differences, which supports the idea of multiple editions or local variants. The scroll's theological vision is aggressive. Where the canonical Torah offers boundaries and ritual, the Temple Scroll demands a perfected holiness. The author claims that Solomon's temple failed to follow God's ideal plan, and that the model in the scroll corrects those errors. The temple here is larger, more majestic, more central. Worship is more centralized, impurity more thoroughly policed. Everything must be pure or removed. The text seems to aim for a total sanctification of society, extending holiness from the temple into daily life. Inside the rooms of the scroll, the layout of courts, storage, gates, inner chambers. The architectural instructions read almost like an engineer's drawing. The dimensions, measurements, and materials are exacting. Ritual chambers for purification, chambers for priests, side rooms, passages, all are described with detail. The scroll also contains laws of sacrifice, offerings, grain, incense, and the timing of festivals. In many cases, it pulls forward verses from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, but often rearranges them or blends sections. Some phrases appear uniquely in the temple scroll, additions not paralleled elsewhere. Because the scroll is a legal text, there is little narrative tension. The drama lies instead in its survival, how a precise, non-narrative manuscript lay sealed in a cave for 2,000 years, invisible until the desert cracked it open. The silence of centuries preserved its message, though much has been lost. Editors confront lacunae, missing columns, torn edges, faded ink. They lean on comparative manuscripts to fill gaps, yet fear interpolation. Every choice, a restored word, a punctuation mark, can shift meaning. The chain of custody after discovery is as intricate as the scroll's own content. When the manuscript was first dug, local Bedouins and antiquities dealers handled it. For over a decade it remained in private hands, hidden beneath floorboards, before scholars intervened. Its fragments were dispersed. Only later were they unified in museum collections. The Israeli authorities now maintain much of the Dead Sea Scroll corpus. The Temple Scroll is managed with high restrictions, given its fragile state and deep significance. Through all this, the Temple Scroll stands as one of the most remarkable forbidden texts. Not because it was banned by an imperial edict, but because its size, technical demands, and theological boldness made it too weighty to disappear entirely under orthodox currents. In its folds lie a vision of a perfect temple, a complete Torah, a sanctified world, a voice reaching from the cave into our modern era, demanding that we look at how ancient communities reimagined their relationship to holiness, law, and the divine. Gospel of Judas, Codex Chakos. The story of the Gospel of Judas begins not in a monastery or an archaeological dig, but in the uncertain world of antiquities trade. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert in the 1970s, a farmer uncovered a limestone box buried near El Minya. Inside was a leather-bound codex, its pages of papyrus darkened and fragile. The book passed from hand to hand, dealers, collectors, middlemen, all looking for profit, not preservation. For decades it was locked away in private vaults stored in a safe, even kept in a bank deposit box. No one understood what it was. When the codex finally reached scholars, it was almost lost. Pages were stuck together by mould, edges had crumbled, and entire lines were gone. Some fragments had vanished completely. The codex had once contained 4 ancient writings, but the most explosive among them was the Gospel of Judas, a text that reimagined one of Christianity's most infamous figures. Radiocarbon tests later dated the papyrus to around the 3rd or 4th century, though the Gospel itself was probably written in the 2nd century. Church fathers like Irenaeus already knew of a Gospel of Judas by that time, calling it a work of heretics who claimed to have secret knowledge. His denunciation seems to describe this same text, but the version found in the Codex is in Coptic, translated from a lost Greek original. When the manuscript was finally restored and translated, its contents shocked everyone. The Gospel opens with a simple line, the secret account of the revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot. It is not a story of betrayal in the familiar sense. Instead, it is a private dialogue, a teaching that separates Judas from the other disciples. In it, Jesus laughs, not mockingly, but as if aware that the others do not understand him. He tells Judas that he alone will grasp the mysteries of the kingdom, that he is destined to sacrifice the man that clothes me. Here, Judas's act is not treachery, it is obedience to a divine plan. By handing Jesus over, Judas releases the spiritual Christ from the prison of flesh. The betrayal becomes the necessary step for liberation, not condemnation. The others, blind to this, worship a lesser god, the creator of the material world. The text portrays the cosmos as ruled by angels and archons, who keep humanity trapped in ignorance. True salvation comes only through knowledge, through awakening to one's divine origin. Such ideas are unmistakably Gnostic. They recast the drama of the crucifixion as a conflict between the world of spirit and the world of matter. The Jesus of this gospel is a revealer of cosmic secrets, and Judas is his chosen instrument. In one passage, Jesus warns Judas of the ridicule he will face, saying, "You will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them." The line turns history on its head. The process of restoration was as intricate as the text itself. Conservators spent years separating the fused papyrus sheets with soft brushes and solvents. Each tiny piece was photographed, flattened, and digitally reassembled. Missing words had to be guessed by context. Even today, large sections are unreadable. The translation team debated each phrase, uncertain whether fragments said holy generation or immortal generation, spirit or shadow. Every decision could shift meaning entirely. When the translation was released in 2006, it ignited controversy. Headlines declared that Judas had been misunderstood for 2,000 years. The Vatican responded cautiously, reminding that the canonical Gospels remained untouched. Scholars were divided. Some saw the text as a major insight into early Christianity's diversity. Others warned that the sensational framing overstated its message. What everyone agreed on was its value as a window into a time when Christian thought was still fluid and fiercely contested. The Codex Chakos that holds the Gospel of Judas also includes the letter of Peter to Philip and 2 other Gnostic works. Together they form a miniature library of forbidden teachings, a collection perhaps buried deliberately when such writings were condemned. The Codex itself bears signs of heavy use: uneven handwriting, reused material, corrections in the margins. Whoever copied it likely lived in a small Egyptian community, preserving texts already banned by the growing Orthodox Church. The physical condition of the book mirrors its history: fragmented, hidden, resurrected. It survived desert tombs, smugglers, neglect and decay before reaching the laboratories of modern conservators. The result is a text that challenges one of Christianity's most entrenched symbols of betrayal. It offers instead a strange reversal. The man remembered for treachery becomes the only disciple who truly understood his master. The Gospel of Judas does not rewrite history, but it reveals how many interpretations once existed before one version became dominant. Locked for centuries in darkness, its pages speak of secret knowledge, divine rebellion, and the thin line between loyalty and betrayal. A forgotten voice, carried from a crumbling codex to the modern world. Copper Scroll, Qumran Cave 3, 1952. A desert canyon remained silent until 1952, when archaeologists exploring Cave 3 at Qumran made one of the most peculiar finds among the Dead Sea Scrolls. A scroll not made of leather or papyrus, but of copper. It would come to be called the Copper Scroll, a hardened record of hidden treasure, sealed by time and oxidation, waiting for modern hands to unlock it. Unlike the other scrolls, this one is not poetry, lore or prophecy. Instead, it reads like an inventory, a catalogue. It lists 64 locations where gold, silver vessels, priestly items, and sacred treasures were buried or concealed across Judea. The language is closer to the Hebrew of the Mishnah than to the literary Hebrew of older scrolls. The names of places are often obscure, the amounts are vast, the descriptions read like instructions. In the ruin in the valley of Achor, under the steps, strong box of silver with weight of 17 talents. The scroll gives distances, landmarks, directions, all to guide someone to dig. Because it was inscribed on metal, the copper scroll resisted decay far longer than papyrus would. But that durability came at a cost. Over centuries, chemical corrosion transformed the copper into a brittle oxide. The sheet had become fragile, cracked, brittle, folded, and rigid. It could not be unrolled without destructive force. Rather than risk destroying it, the government of Jordan sent the scroll to Manchester in England. There, in 1955-56, experts cut it into strips, 23 strips, so each could be read and conserved. That process itself damaged parts. Once cut and photographed, scholars began reconstructing the meaning. They aligned edges, matched breaks, compared duplicates. They noticed the style of writing was different. Here the scribe uses Hebrew with rare spellings and occasional Greek letters appended, perhaps for numbers. The vocabulary is unique, with terms not found elsewhere in ancient texts. That makes translating risky. A missing letter, a variant spelling, or a misread line could change meaning across entire entries. Because the text lists buried treasure, debates emerged. Was it real or symbolic? Some believe the Copper Scroll describes actual temple treasure hidden before the destruction of Jerusalem's temple. Others think it is symbolic or sectarian lore, an idealized map rather than a literal guide. No conclusive dig has matched the clues. Some treasure hunters followed the directions to caves, cisterns, pits, but came up empty or found nothing verifiable. One intriguing name on the scroll is Kolit, a location mentioned several times. Some interpret it as the site of a second scroll, a backup list with further details. But no such second copy has been found, and the place known as Kolit remains unidentified. The Copper Scroll also claims a duplicate text hidden somewhere else, perhaps in a cistern. That mystery echoes the whole mystery, a list of treasures pointing to more lists hidden behind hidden maps. Archaeologists know Cave 3 also held fragments of Ezekiel, Psalms, Lamentations, and Isaiah commentary, but nothing else like the Copper Scroll's genre. It lay deep in the cave, in the rear, slightly apart from other scrolls. Some scholars argue it was deposited later, perhaps by a group outside the Qumran sect, or during a later revolt. Others think it may date close to the 1st century CE. Some suggest just before the Roman destruction of the temple. Others even during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. Because its language is closer to later Hebrew and its content is unique, its place in time is contested. The physical gaps in the Copper Scroll force editors to make choices. Some columns are badly corroded, entire place names vanish on torn edges, words are missing. Where letters remain, they are sometimes ambiguous. Scholars lean on parallel entries, context, and educated guesswork. But every guessed reconstruction remains speculative. A missing letter here might conceal whether an instruction is dig down 40 cubits or dig up 40 cubits. That uncertainty haunts every translation. One feature draws attention. The scale of treasures described is enormous. Gold, silver, priestly vessels, and sacred objects. The quantities invest the scroll with drama. If real, the stash could outstrip ordinary wealth. That raises questions. Could a sect have amassed that much? Or was this a communal or temple reserve? Or is the text hyperbolic, perhaps idealized to vindicate a movement's legitimacy? Because no definitive treasure matching the scroll's list has been found, some suspect the wealth was looted, or that Romans retrieved it, or that our identifications of the places are wrong. A few sites speculated in modern research match ancient names, but none with convincing artifacts corresponding to the quantities claimed. Some proposed that the treasure was already removed in antiquity. Others argue the scroll's numbers were symbolic or partly fictional. Still, the Copper Scroll remains a singular artifact, a map preserved in metal, buried with intention, locked by corrosion, and slowly unlocked by modern forensic scholars. It offers a rare intersection of text, treasure myth, archaeology, and theology. In its brittle folds, it poses questions. What was sacred wealth? Who guarded it? Why hide it? It forces us to reckon with the possibility of lost riches, and the fragile chance that any scroll even of metal can survive millennia to whisper its clues. Or Scroll 1QM Qumran. In 1947, when Bedouin herders first stumbled upon the caves of Qumran, they could not have imagined that among the jars of brittle parchment lay a war manual, one that described the final battle between good and evil. Years later, from those caves, scholars would piece together a scroll now called the War Scroll, catalogued as 1QM. It was not a story, not a prophecy, but a plan, a guidebook for the apocalypse. The scroll is written in Hebrew and dates from around the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. It was found rolled tightly inside a jar, along with the community's other writings. When it was first unrolled, the parchment was cracked, torn, and incomplete. Still, enough remained to reveal its content, an organized, detailed account of a cosmic conflict known as the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. The text belongs to the Library of the Essenes, a Jewish sect that had withdrawn to Qumran, waiting for the end of days. The War Scroll opens with a declaration of holy war. It describes the armies of light, the faithful followers of God called the sons of Levi, Judah, and Benjamin, facing the forces of darkness, made up of foreign nations led by a figure symbolizing evil. The language is military, precise, almost bureaucratic. The scroll gives battle formations, trumpet signals, banners, and weapon specifications. There are instructions for priests to blow specific trumpets at certain stages of the battle, and for how soldiers should purify themselves before fighting. The The plan unfolds like a campaign manual. The war will last 40 years, 6 years of fighting and 1 year of rest, repeated in cycles until the final victory. Each phase is prescribed. Priests lead the troops, invoking divine protection. Angels join the human armies, fighting alongside them. God is described as commanding the host directly, ensuring victory in the climactic 7th battle. Its language mixes ritual and strategy. The army is divided into divisions of thousands, hundreds, 50s and 10s, echoing ancient biblical organization. Every weapon is ritualized. Shields, spears and swords are to be polished and inscribed with phrases like the power of God. Trumpets bear labels such as Trumpet of the Summons or Trumpet of Slain Enemies. Even the banners are detailed, decorated with symbols of tribes and heavenly hosts. At times, the text shifts from strategy to theology. It speaks of Belial, a name used for the leader of evil, as the ruler of darkness who commands the forces of the nations. Against him stand the sons of light, guided by the archangel Michael. The scroll reflects a dual worldview where every event on earth mirrors an unseen celestial struggle. Battles below are linked to battles above, and human victory depends on divine alignment. The manuscript itself is not uniform. Scholars have identified at least 19 columns of text, but portions are missing or heavily damaged. Some sections appear to repeat, suggesting that scribes may have copied or reworked older templates. Other fragments found in nearby caves, labelled as War of the Messiah or War Rule, appear to be related. Together they show that the idea of an end-time conflict was central to the community's theology. The physical scroll, written on parchment in an early Herodian script, shows corrections and margin notes by the scribe. Some letters are bolded for emphasis, others fade, suggesting pauses or revisions. At points the ink was reapplied, perhaps decades later, before being sealed away. The material itself, exposed to the dry desert air, stiffened but survived better than papyrus would have. For the people of Qumran, this document was not metaphor. It was a manual for real preparation, a blend of military discipline and spiritual purity. Archaeological evidence from the settlement supports this view. Weapons, arrowheads, and watchtowers have been found near the site. The scroll's instructions for ritual cleansing and strict hierarchy match the community's daily rules preserved in other scrolls, like the Manual of Discipline. Yet, for modern readers, the War Scroll sits between worlds, part liturgy, part strategy. Some scholars believe it was a symbolic drama of divine justice. Others think it reflects genuine preparations for rebellion against Rome. Its mix of realism and revelation blurs the line between faith and warfare. The scroll was first published in the 1950s, translated from fragments into Hebrew and English. Further copies were found later, confirming that it circulated within the community. The preserved sections are now held in Jerusalem's Shrine of the Book, protected from humidity and light. Each column of text is displayed in digital reconstruction, line by line, where even the smallest letters reveal the scribe's steady hand. The War Scroll stands apart from the other Dead Sea writings for its tone of certainty. It does not ask if the battle will happen, it tells how it must be fought. Its writers imagined a world where angels march beside men, where priests led warriors, and where holiness and war were the same cause. Preserved in the silence of a cave for 2,000 years, it remains a glimpse into a community that lived waiting for the final trumpet to sound. Damascus Document, Cairo Geniza, 1896-97, Qumran. In the last years of the 19th century, 2 scholars entered a small, dim room in Cairo's Ben Ezra synagogue. Dust thickened the air, and piles of ancient papers lay stacked floor to ceiling. This was the Geniza, a sealed repository where Jewish communities stored old or damaged writings that could not be thrown away. Among its hundreds of thousands of fragments lay a text unlike anything else, a document that spoke of secret covenants, punishments, and a community set apart from all others. It would come to be known as the Damascus Document. The Geniza had remained sealed for centuries, protecting centuries of Jewish history. When Solomon Schechter and Agnes Lewis began sorting its contents in 1896, they pulled out 2 long Hebrew manuscripts filled with laws, moral instructions, and community rules. The writing seemed ancient, the theology strange, halfway between biblical command and monastic discipline. Schechter published it in 1910, naming it the Damascus Document after a repeated phrase describing a new covenant in the land of Damascus. He had no idea what group it referred to or when it was written. Half a century later, in 1947, new scrolls were found in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea. Among them were fragments written in the same style and language as the text from Cairo. The pieces fit, the rules matched, words, phrases, and even breaks in the text aligned almost perfectly. The realization was immediate. The document found sealed in a Cairo synagogue was part of the same ancient collection hidden in desert caves 2,000 years earlier. 2 caches, one urban and one desert, preserved by accident across continents and time. The Damascus Document is one of the oldest sectarian texts connected to the community, often identified as the Essenes. It outlines the structure of their society, their laws, and their worldview. It is divided into 2 major sections: an exhortation, a sermon warning Israel to turn from sin and follow the covenant, and a set of community rules. The text speaks of a teacher of righteousness, a guiding figure who interprets divine law and leads the faithful. It also mentions an interpreter of the law, suggesting a hierarchy of spiritual authority. Within its lines are detailed regulations. Members must swear oaths, keep strict Sabbath rules, avoid wealth, and separate from outsiders. The text warns against the scoffers of the covenant, describing them as those who betrayed the community's secrets. Punishments are severe: expulsion for lying, exclusion for ritual impurity, and precise periods of repentance measured in days or years. It insists on communal sharing of property, purity of speech, and ritual washing. The most enigmatic phrase, "the new covenant in the land of Damascus," has drawn endless debate. Some scholars believe Damascus was symbolic, a code for the group's place of exile or spiritual refuge. Others think it referred to an actual location, perhaps where the sect first organized before retreating to Qumran. The document's tone is urgent, as though it was written during a time of crisis, calling the faithful to prepare for divine judgment. The Qumran fragments, found in caves 4, 5, and 6, confirm the antiquity of the text. The oldest copies date to the 1st century BCE, centuries older than the Cairo manuscripts. The variations between the versions reveal that the document was copied and recopied over generations. Some lines in the Qumran versions are shorter, others contain alternate phrases. This suggests an evolving text, adjusted as the community's beliefs developed. Physically, the Qumran copies were written on parchment, fragmentary and torn, while the Cairo manuscripts, written on medieval paper, represent later descendants of the same work. The discovery bridged 2 worlds, the desert caves and the medieval synagogue, showing that the sect's writings somehow survived long after their authors vanished. How the text travelled from the Judean wilderness to medieval Egypt remains uncertain. It may have been preserved by later Jewish groups who respected its piety without knowing its origins. The contents of the Damascus document overlap with other Dead Sea writings like the Community Rule and the War Scroll, but it stands apart in tone. It sounds less utopian and more practical. It describes how to live in anticipation of the end but still survive day to day. It sets up a council of 12 men and 3 priests, defines their duties, and even dictates how disputes are to be judged. It reads like a manual for a disciplined brotherhood, combining scripture with legal reform. Schechtter's discovery in Cairo was monumental, even before Qumran's finds, but the link between the 2 changed everything. Scholars now saw that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not isolated. They connected to texts already known, stored for safekeeping in Jewish archives 1,000 miles away. The fragments in the caves and the manuscripts from the Geniza form 2 halves of one tradition, separated by centuries but telling the same story, of a people who believe themselves chosen to guard divine law against a corrupt world. The Damascus document remains one of the best preserved windows into that world. Its letters, black and steady, still carry the same instructions laid down by a community waiting for judgment. From the silence of a sealed Geniza and the dust of desert caves, its words meet again, bridging 2 forgotten libraries that somehow outlasted their keepers. Book of Enoch, Ethiopic tradition, brought to Europe 1773. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned from 6 years in Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, carrying several ancient manuscripts written in Ge'ez, the classical Ethiopian language. Among them was a book that few in Europe had seen for over 1,000 years. When scholars began translating it, they realized it was a text long thought lost, one that had vanished from Western Bibles but survived in the East. It was the Book of Enoch, also known as 1 Enoch, a vast apocalyptic vision once cherished by early Jews and Christians, then later banned and forgotten. The Book of Enoch is attributed to the great-grandfather of Noah, the man who, according to Genesis, walked with God and was taken. The work expands that single line into an immense revelation. It describes Enoch's journeys through the heavens, guided by angels, where he witnesses the architecture of the cosmos, the courses of the stars, the prisons of fallen spirits, and the throne of the Almighty. It explains the origin of evil as the rebellion of angels who descended to earth and corrupted humanity. For centuries, Western scholars knew of Enoch only through quotations and allusions. The New Testament letter of Jude quotes directly from it. "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones." Early church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria considered it inspired, but by the 4th century it had vanished from canonical lists. Rabbis in Palestine rejected it as too speculative. Church leaders in the West labelled it heretical. Yet in Ethiopia, where Christianity developed in isolation, the book endured. It remained part of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, copied and read for generations, sealed away from Europe's theological debates. When Bruce's manuscripts reached Europe, their authenticity was doubted. Some dismissed them as forgeries or Christian fabrications. It was only in the 19th century that scholars recognized their ancient roots. The Ethiopic versions preserved 5 books within one larger composition: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Each section combined myth, calendar, and prophecy into a single cosmic narrative. The Book of the Watchers, the oldest portion, tells how a group of angels known as the Watchers descended to Earth, took human wives, and taught forbidden arts. Metalworking, cosmetics, sorcery. Their offspring, the Nephilim, filled the world with violence. In response, Enoch is taken up to plead with God on their behalf, but judgment is sealed. The Watchers are cast into a pit until the final day. The text turns the brief Genesis episode into a full drama of rebellion, punishment, and hidden wisdom. The astronomical book shifts tone, describing the laws that govern the sun, moon, and stars, a detailed calendar that divides the year into precise cycles. This solar calendar, differing from the traditional lunar reckoning, became important centuries later, when fragments of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those fragments, written in Aramaic, matched the Ethiopic version almost word for word. They proved that the Book of Enoch was not a medieval invention, but a genuine Jewish work from the Second Temple period, older than the New Testament itself. That discovery, made at Qumran in the 1950s, changed everything. The sect that lived there, often identified as the Essenes, clearly revered Enoch. They copied and stored multiple portions of it, especially the Book of the Watchers. Its themes of angelic rebellion, divine judgment, and the coming of a Messiah aligned with their worldview. The Qumran copies are among the oldest surviving biblical manuscripts, dating to the 2nd century BCE. The language of 1 Enoch is rich with symbols that later shaped apocalyptic thought. Heaven and hell are not abstract states, but real landscapes. The righteous dwell in light. The fallen angels abound under mountains. Stars become living beings. The universe operates by divine measurement. The text even describes the figure of a Son of Man, enthroned beside God, imagery that later echoed in Christian writings. Physically, the Ethiopic manuscripts that reached Europe were complete but fragile. Written on parchment, they contained ornate headings and marginal notes from Ethiopian monks who had preserved the lineage of scribes copying it for over a millennium. Modern translations were made from those same manuscripts, some now stored in Oxford and Paris. The Ge'ez text differs slightly between copies, showing that scribes adapted spelling and syntax over time, but the core message remained intact. Today, 1 Enoch stands as a rare example of a text once condemned in the West, yet faithfully transmitted in Africa. Its journey, from ancient Judea to the mountains of Ethiopia, from the hidden libraries of monasteries to the caves of Qumran, links worlds that history tried to separate. For 2,000 years, the words of Enoch waited, sealed in languages and landscapes far apart, until fragments from desert caves confirmed that they had been telling the same story all along. Book of Jubilees, Ethiopic and Qumran. When fragments of ancient parchment were pulled from the caves of Qumran in the 1950s, among them appeared a familiar story told in an unfamiliar voice, the Book of Jubilees, a text that retold the opening books of the Bible but through the language of angels and sacred calendars. It had been preserved in fragments of Hebrew at Qumran and in complete form far away in the highlands of Ethiopia, where it had survived for centuries in Ge'ez translation. The Book of Jubilees calls itself the Lesser Genesis. It covers the same ground as Genesis and the early chapters of Exodus, but it rearranges everything into a divine schedule. The world's history unfolds not simply in years, but in a perfect rhythm of jubilees, periods of 49 years each. Angels dictate the story to Moses on Mount Sinai, explaining that even time itself was measured and recorded before creation. Every event, the flood, the covenant with Abraham, the exodus from Egypt, takes place according to that celestial clock. In this version, the patriarchs are not just human figures. They are part of a grand cosmic order supervised by angelic beings. Angels record births, oaths, and covenants. They teach laws about purity, festivals, and the phases of the moon. Jubilees insists that the true calendar is solar, not lunar, a 364-day year divided evenly into 4 quarters. To its writers, this perfect calendar was sacred, the same used by angels in heaven. Using a different one, they warned, meant falling out of sync with divine time. That insistence on heavenly order helps explain why the Book of Jubilees was eventually excluded from Jewish and Christian canons. Rabbinic authorities preferred the lunar calendar used in the temple. Jubilees defended a rival system. Its strict separation of clean and unclean practices, its expanded laws about food and marriage, and its bold claim that angels had revealed these commands directly to Moses made it suspect to later theologians. Yet, to the community at Qumran, it fit perfectly. The scrolls show that the sect living there followed the same solar calendar, calling themselves the Sons of Light. They copied and stored Jubilees alongside their other sacred writings, seeing it as confirmation that their way matched the divine pattern. The text tone is part law, part revelation. It tells how demons arose from the spirits of the Nephilim, how Noah prayed for protection against them, and how an angel taught him medicine made from plants to heal humanity. It gives new details about Abraham's testing, Jacob's visions, and the origin of festivals. The Sabbath, Passover, and even circumcision are traced back to heaven itself, where angels supposedly celebrate them long before humans were created. The Qumran fragments of Jubilees written in Hebrew prove beyond doubt that the book was an ancient Jewish work, not a later Christian creation as once thought. The copies date between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE. Before those discoveries, scholars knew the book only from the Ethiopian version, which had been preserved in its entirety within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's canon. That version, translated from Greek and ultimately from Hebrew, had reached Europe through manuscripts brought by travellers in the 15th and 16th centuries. When scholars compared the Ethiopian text with the Hebrew fragments from Qumran, they found remarkable agreement. The same phrases, names, and chronological systems appeared in both. The only differences were small variations introduced by scribes across centuries. Those matches confirmed that the Ethiopian Church had preserved an authentic ancient tradition that the rest of the world had lost. The structure of the book reflects its obsession with order. It divides history from creation to Sinai into exactly 50 Jubilee periods, 2,450 years, emphasizing that nothing in the universe happens without measure. Even sin and redemption occur according to appointed cycles. Its writer wanted to show that divine law was eternal, written into time itself. Archaeologists found multiple copies of Jubilees at Qumran, making it one of the most common works in the caves after the books of Psalms and Isaiah. The presence of so many copies suggests it was central to that community's belief system. The sect's own regulations often quote it directly, especially regarding purity and the calendar. The overlap hints that Jubilees may have shaped their entire worldview. The surviving Ethiopian manuscripts are ornate, written in black and red ink on parchment, often decorated with geometric borders. Some contain marginal notes from priests explaining festivals and counting of days. These manuscripts date from the 15th century, but they clearly descend from a much older chain of copies that stretches back to antiquity. The Book of Jubilees offers a glimpse into a version of Judaism that merged revelation with cosmic mathematics. It speaks with the voice of angels who measure not only time but righteousness. Buried in desert caves and safeguarded in mountain monasteries, it bridges two worlds that never met. yet preserved the same secret calendar of creation. Demotic Book of Thoth, Ptolemaic Egypt, published in 2005. In the quiet storerooms of European and Egyptian museums, scattered fragments of papyrus sat for more than a century, labelled, catalogued, and mostly ignored. Their writing was not in Greek or hieroglyphs, but in Demotic, the everyday script of late Egypt, a form so cursive and compact that even experts struggle to read it. Only in the early 2000s did scholars realise that these fragments, gathered from London, Copenhagen, Paris, Vienna and New York, belong to the same ancient work, the Book of Thoth, a lost dialogue between a teacher and a student about the nature of wisdom itself. The Book of Thoth dates to the Ptolemaic period, roughly between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, when Egypt was ruled by Greek kings, but its temples still trained priests in the old traditions. It is written as a conversation between a master, often identified with the god Thoth, and a student called the One Who Loves Knowledge. Their exchange unfolds through questions, riddles, and symbolic teachings on how divine understanding is gained and how language connects the human and the divine. Thoth, in Egyptian belief, was the god of writing, mathematics, and magic, the keeper of cosmic balance and the inventor of hieroglyphs. The book that bears his name does not describe rituals or spells like the later Book of the Dead. Instead, it explores the philosophy behind sacred writing. It speaks of how a scribe becomes worthy of divine speech, how wisdom must be purified through silence, and how knowledge can both illuminate and endanger the soul. The fragments that make up this work were written on papyrus in black ink, with red headings marking changes in speakers. Some were first found at Hermopolis, the city sacred to Thoth, and others in temple archives such as Tebtunis and Edfu. For decades they were treated as unrelated temple texts, prayers, or lists. It took careful comparison of handwriting, vocabulary, and recurring phrases for scholars to recognise that the same dialogue continued across different collections. The process of reconstruction was painstaking. The papyri are incomplete, burned, and damaged by moisture. Sentences break off mid-line, words fade, and sometimes only a few signs remain. Each fragment had to be digitally scanned, cleaned, and matched by shape and fibre pattern. When joined together, they revealed a teacher guiding a disciple toward initiation, a symbolic journey rather than a literal ceremony. The language shifts between poetic imagery and practical advice. The teacher warns against arrogance, reminds the student to listen more than speak, and describes writing as a sacred act that can shape the world. The dialogue's structure mirrors Egyptian temple education. In the Ptolemaic period, scribes were trained not only in writing but in theology, astronomy, and ritual recitation. The Book of Thoth likely served as a model for such instruction. It reflects a world where knowledge was guarded closely, accessible only to those prepared to receive it. The master repeatedly tests the student's understanding, asking, "What is the path of the tongue? And who is the one who listens to silence?" Each riddle draws the learner deeper into reflection. Modern scholars who published the text in 2005, Richard Jasnow and Carl Theodor Zausich, translated more than 670 fragments. They discovered that the book blends traditional Egyptian thought with subtle Greek influences, showing how native priests responded to foreign rule by emphasizing their own sacred heritage. The Demotic language itself captures that transition, rooted in hieroglyphic tradition but simplified for daily temple use. The dialogue mentions sacred places, the House of Life, where temple scribes copied texts and conducted rituals of preservation. It refers to the Great Throne of Thoth, perhaps symbolizing both the temple's inner sanctuary and the throne of intellect. At times, the teacher speaks as a divine being, at others as a human mentor. The tone alternates between stern instruction and mystical revelation. The student, uncertain and humble, repeats phrases of devotion, calling himself a little one in the house of wisdom. Unlike other Egyptian religious writings, the Book of Thoth avoids mythic storytelling. There are no battles between gods, no funerary spells. Its subject is knowledge itself, how it is spoken, written, transmitted, and protected. This made it unusual even in its own time. The Egyptians saw writing as a living power. To copy a text was to recreate divine order. In this context, the Book of Thoth stands as a reflection on that sacred duty written by priests who feared their language and wisdom were fading under Greek domination. Because the papyri were scattered, the text remained unknown until the early 21st century. Each museum held a few pages, none realizing they belonged to a larger whole. When assembled, they revealed a forgotten intellectual dialogue, a window into the mind of the temple scribe, a world where writing was magic, silence was discipline, and wisdom was a conversation between man and God. Greek magical papyri, PGM, 2nd CE, BCE, 5th C, CE. When fragments of papyrus began appearing in European collections during the 19th century, scholars noticed something strange about them. They weren't philosophical dialogues or business contracts. They were spells, lines of Greek mixed with Egyptian words, instructions for calling gods, invoking dreams, commanding spirits, and protecting the dead. Together they would come to be known as the Greek Magical Papyri, or PGM, a vast body of ancient magic that had survived in secret for nearly 2 millennia. Most of these texts were written between the 2nd century BCE and the 5th century CE, during the long meeting of Greek, Egyptian and Roman cultures. They were found in Egypt, where the dry climate preserved papyrus better than anywhere else. Magic there was never separate from religion. Priests performed both official rituals and private rites, but as temples declined under foreign rule, their secret practices migrated to underground circles, where scribes copied fragments of ritual books for private clients. The papyri that survived include hundreds of spells, prayers, recipes, and diagrams. Some are a few lines long, others fill dozens of pages. They cover nearly every purpose a person could imagine: healing illness, winning love, ensuring victory, seeing the future, summoning divine protection, or cursing an enemy. The language blends Greek hymns with Egyptian and Hebrew divine names, showing how cosmopolitan late antique Egypt had become. One text calls on the god who is in the middle of the sea whose name is hidden. Another instructs the user to draw circles, light lamps, and speak sacred words at precise hours of the night. The manuscripts were never meant for public reading. They were working manuals written for trained magicians, priests, or scribes. Many refer to themselves as holy books or books of the learned. A recurring name is Moses, invoked not as a prophet but as an ancient master of magic, reflecting the Egyptian-Greek belief that Jewish and Egyptian traditions shared divine wisdom. Other texts mention Hermes, Isis, and the Christian god in the same breath. The result is a fusion of traditions, a spiritual experiment written in ink. The modern story of the Greek magical papyri begins in the early 1800s, when antique dealers in Thebes, Egypt, began selling papyrus bundles to European collectors. Many came from a single trove buried in a tomb, likely the private library of a magician or priest from Roman Egypt. Parts of it were purchased by museums in London, Paris and Berlin, others by private buyers. The largest portion, acquired by the Prussian consul Giovanni Anastasi, became known as the Thebes cache. For decades, no one understood what the texts were. Their mix of Greek, Coptic and Demotic confused scholars. Only in the 20th century did researchers begin to recognize their unity. They realized that these scrolls formed a continuous magical tradition, not random scraps. Editors grouped them under a single collection, the Papyri Graecae Magicae, and began publishing transcriptions and translations. The first full editions appeared in the 1920s and 1930s, edited in Germany, and they revealed a hidden world of ancient ritual. The contents are extraordinary. There are invocations to Helios and Selene, long hymns of creation, and precise lists of ingredients: milk, honey, frankincense, myrrh, even blood. Some rituals involve crafting figurines or binding tablets. Others use simple spoken formulas. A few describe visionary experiences in which the magician sees the god face to face. The most elaborate, the so-called Mithras Liturgy, guides the initiate through 7 cosmic spheres to behold the divine fire of creation. It reads like both a prayer and an ascent ritual. Alongside these are love charms, curses, and protective amulets. The moral boundaries are blurred. The same book could bless or destroy. What mattered was precision, pronouncing divine names exactly, keeping ritual purity, timing actions to planetary hours. Each papyrus carries marginal notes, corrections, or added diagrams, showing that they were used and copied by hand, not simply preserved as sacred objects. The scribes who wrote them used black and red ink, just like temple texts, and often included directions such as, "Say these words secretly," or "Do not show to the uninitiated." Some passages warn that revealing the spells brings punishment from the gods. others promise extraordinary power, to command spirits, summon light, or make the dead speak. Yet even with their bold claims, they read less like fiction and more like manuals born from centuries of ritual tradition. Because the papyri were found through dealers rather than excavation, their original context is partly lost. Some came from tombs, others from temple ruins or private caches. But together they form one of the largest archives of magical writing from antiquity. Today, pieces of the PGM are housed in museums from Leiden to Chicago, each fragment preserving a few more lines of the ancient craft. The Greek magical papyri blur the border between prayer and incantation, scholarship and sorcery. Written by scribes who saw no contradiction between science, religion and magic, they capture a world where knowledge itself was power, a power that had to be spoken aloud, guarded in secret, and passed on only to those who could read the language of gods. Mithras Liturgy, PGM-4. In the heart of one of the largest Greek magical papyri, hidden among hundreds of spells and invocations, lies a long, self-contained ritual unlike anything else in antiquity. Modern scholars call it the Mithras Liturgy, though it is not a liturgy of the Roman god Mithras in the strict sense. It is a theurgic ascent, a step-by-step guide to rising through the heavens to meet the divine light itself. The text occupies a central section of the papyrus known as PGM-4, a long scroll copied in Egypt sometime between the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Written in Greek with occasional Egyptian terms, it reads like a manual for a priest-magician Slizunar, someone who believed that the human soul could approach the gods through ritual, voice and vision. The passage begins suddenly, "I call upon you, the greatest God, Lord of the seven winds." What follows is not a prayer for fortune or protection, but a carefully staged mystical journey through the cosmos. Unlike other spells in the papyri, this one is highly structured. The ritual directs the initiate to face east, purify himself, and breathe in the rising sun's energy. The performer must use precise vocal sounds, long vowels and guttural tones, to harmonize with cosmic powers. Each sound corresponds to one of the planetary spheres. As the recitation builds, the soul symbolically rises through the layers of the universe, meeting guardians of fire, ether, and light. The text describes dazzling visions, rivers of flame, spinning wheels of light, a fiery god whose body shines brighter than the sun. The initiate is told to speak words of recognition, secret names and formulas that affirm his readiness to pass each gate. At the climax, he sees the supreme deity, a being of golden fire surrounded by eternal light. The instructions promise that the initiate will become immortal in spirit, joining the divine realm and returning with insight. Although the ritual uses the name Mithras, the content mixes Greek, Egyptian and Hermetic elements, rather than anything from the Roman Mithraic mysteries. Scholars think Mithras here stands as a title for the cosmic mediator, the god who bridges heaven and earth. The ritual belongs more to theurgy, a form of sacred practice aimed not at manipulating gods, but at uniting with them through purified knowledge. The papyrus that preserves this text likely came from a magician's personal library in Roman Egypt. It was written by a professional scribe familiar with both Greek philosophy and temple liturgy. The handwriting is neat, the ink steady, with sections marked in red to guide the practitioner. Marginal notes add warnings like "say in a whisper" or "do not reveal." The secrecy reflects the text's purpose. It was not for casual use, but for initiates trained in both language and ritual control. The steps of the ritual follow a clear ascent through the 7 planetary spheres, a pattern shared with other late antique mystical traditions. Each stage is marked by a new set of divine beings and vocal sounds. The initiate must perform controlled breathing, gazing at light and uttering sequences of vowels believed to carry cosmic vibration. The voice acts as the bridge between mortal and divine. The higher the sound, the closer to the gods. Alongside its spiritual symbolism, the Mithras Liturgy gives a glimpse into ancient scientific and religious fusion. The author knew the structure of the heavens as understood in Greco-Egyptian astronomy. 7 planets ruled by divine intelligences, surrounded by the fixed stars and a supreme god beyond. The ascent through these layers mirrors philosophical ideas found in Plato and later Neoplatonism, where the soul's destiny is to rise back to its source. Preserved within PGM-4, the liturgy is part of a larger compilation of magical and philosophical texts. Its neighbours on the scroll include love charms, healing incantations, and prayers to Egyptian deities. But the Mithras Liturgy stands apart in tone, solemn, visionary, and elevated. It treats ritual as revelation, not manipulation. The papyrus itself was found in Egypt, likely around Thebes during the 19th century. It entered European collections through dealers, then scholars identified it as part of the same Theban cache that produced most of the Greek magical papyri. When the text was first translated in the early 20th century, it astonished readers. It read like a mystical manual rather than superstition, a complete journey from Earth to the divine Sun. The ritual closes with instructions to descend safely, to return unharmed to the body. The initiate, having seen the eternal light, is told to remember the vision and keep silence. The tone is neither fearful nor triumphant but serene, the voice of someone who has glimpsed the divine and come back transformed. For the ancient magician or priest who copied these words, it was the highest form of knowledge. To speak the names of heaven, to rise through the fire of the stars, and to behold the God of light face to face. Derveni Papyrus, found 1962, 4th century BCE. In 1962, workers digging a burial mound near Derveni in northern Greece uncovered a cremation tomb belonging to a high-ranking Macedonian. Among the remains lay a bundle of papyrus so blackened and brittle that it seemed no more than ash. When conservators unrolled the fragments, they realized they were holding something unprecedented, a philosophical poem commentary written in Greek script from the 4th century BCE. It would become known as the Derveni Papyrus, often called the oldest surviving book in Europe. The papyrus had been partly burned by the funeral pyre that consumed the body it accompanied. Yet, the same fire that charred it also preserved it. The heat sealed the layers and prevented them from disintegrating completely. Over time, scholars used infrared photography and digital imaging to read the ink trapped within the carbonized surface, recovering sentences that had not been seen since the age of Socrates. The text itself is a commentary on an older Orphic poem, a theogony, a story of how the gods and the cosmos came to be, attributed to the mythical poet Orpheus. Orphic writings were part of an ancient Greek religious tradition focused on purification, rebirth, and the soul's divine origin. They circulated privately, often among initiates of mystery cults, and were rarely written down. The Derveni Papyrus preserves one of these texts, accompanied by a scholar's explanation written in the style of philosophical exegesis. The work begins with the Orphic verses, describing the creation of the world through divine succession. Night gives birth to Uranus, Uranus to Cronus, and Cronus to Zeus, who then swallows the phallus of his father and recreates all things through his mind. The commentary that follows interprets these mythic acts not as literal events, but as symbols of natural processes. The author treats the poem as allegory, a coded explanation of how the universe is structured. Zeus, he says, represents nous, or cosmic intellect. The divine swallowing symbolizes the unity of all things within the rational mind of the cosmos. This merging of myth and philosophy is what makes the Derveni Papyrus so unusual. It bridges religion, ritual, and the earliest natural philosophy. The author was not a mystic, but a thinker influenced by Anaxagoras, Heraclitus, and the Pre-Socratics, philosophers who sought rational explanations for the world. For him, Orpheus's verses were not superstition but ancient wisdom that needed decoding. The gods were metaphors for elements and forces, air, fire, mind, and order, working together through necessity and reason. The papyrus also contains glimpses of ritual practice. Early sections describe priests performing sacrifices, burning offerings, and reading omens from smoke. The author comments critically, suggesting that common worshippers misunderstand the deeper meaning of these rites. He insists that true understanding requires knowledge of hidden doctrine, the kind revealed by interpreting Orpheus correctly. Religion, in his view, was philosophy concealed in mythic language. Physically, the Derveni Papyrus consists of 26 columns of text, though many are fragmentary. The handwriting is neat in a classical Greek script, showing it was a professional copy, likely produced for a scholar or initiate. Its placement in a tomb suggests that the owner regarded it as sacred, perhaps a guide to the afterlife, or a symbol of intellectual purification. The scroll was folded and laid beside the deceased, not as decoration but as part of his personal beliefs. For decades after its discovery, the text remained partly unreadable. The fragile fragments were stored in Thessaloniki, and access was limited to specialists. Only after advanced imaging in the early 2000s could scholars piece together more than 90% of the surviving text. What emerged was a continuous treatise, part religious commentary, part philosophical argument. The author's tone is confident, almost polemical. He mocks those who take the myths literally, calling them fools who hear without understanding. He defends the poets as wise men who hid truth behind riddles. He explains the sacrifices not as gifts to gods, but as acts that maintain the cosmic balance through symbolic correspondence. Every ritual, every name of a god, reflects a natural principle. The papyrus also preserves early Greek words for metaphysical ideas later adopted by philosophers, terms for soul, fate, intellect, and necessity. It shows that by the late 5th century BCE, Greek thinkers were already blending mythic tradition with rational inquiry. The text's combination of poetic theology and physical theory foreshadows later Hellenistic philosophy, where divine and natural law became inseparable. Reading it today requires patience. Many lines are incomplete. Some words exist only as a few letters. The blackened fibers still crumble under light. Yet through infrared scans, the script glows faintly silver against the dark surface. Piece by piece, editors have reconstructed its voice. A rare sound from the world before Plato, speaking of fire, air, and divine mind as one. The Derveni Papyrus stands as a survival of a lost intellectual landscape, a document written by a philosopher priest who saw no boundary between science, myth, and ritual. It was buried with its reader, burned by fire, sealed by chance, and rediscovered 2,000 years later. A dialogue between the mysteries of Orpheus and the beginnings of reason, written on the world's oldest surviving book. Orphic gold tablets, lamella 4th 2nd C BCE. In graves scattered across southern Italy, Crete and Thessaly, archaeologists have found small, thin sheets of gold no larger than a playing card. They were folded or rolled, placed on the chest, in the mouth, or beside the hands of the dead. Each carried a few lines of tiny Greek text engraved with deliberate care, directions meant to guide the soul after death. These are known as the Orphic gold tablets, or lamellae, relics of an ancient mystery tradition that promised its followers safe passage through the underworld. The first of these tablets was found in the 1800s in the Greek colony of Thurii in southern Italy. More have since appeared in tombs across the Greek world, dating between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE. Though each one is unique, they share a common purpose: to provide initiates with passwords, formulas, and ritual knowledge needed after death. The inscriptions are brief, written in a language both poetic and cryptic, addressed to the soul that has just left the body. The texts describe what to do upon entering the realm of Hades. They instruct the dead not to drink from the spring of forgetfulness, but instead to seek the lake of memory, guarded by divine beings. There, the initiate must speak precise words. "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. I am parched with thirst. Give me to drink from the ever-flowing spring." By declaring divine origin, the soul affirms its right to immortality. The guardians then grant access to the blessed path, leading to reunion with the gods. Some tablets are more elaborate, mapping out the geography of the afterlife: crossroads, gates, and guardians. Others are simpler, containing only short phrases such as "Pure I come from the pure," or "Tell Persephone that Bacchios himself has freed me." The variations suggest local initiatory groups with slightly different teachings, all connected to Orphism, a movement centered on the mythical poet Orpheus, who was said to have descended into the underworld and returned. Orphic belief taught that the soul was divine but imprisoned in the body, condemned to cycles of rebirth until purified through ritual and knowledge. Death was a passage, not an end, and these gold tablets served as reminders of the truths learned in life. They were proof of initiation and, in a sense, tickets of passage. The golden material symbolized incorruptibility, ensuring that the instructions would endure as the body decayed. Physically, the lamellae are fragile. Each weighs only a few grams and measures between 3 and 10 centimeters long. The letters are scratched with a fine stylus, sometimes unevenly, suggesting the work of local scribes rather than professional engravers. Despite their simplicity, the inscriptions follow a consistent formula, implying a shared oral tradition. Some include decorative borders or small punched holes, perhaps for attachment to garments or for folding around a string. The discovery of multiple tablets in different regions has revealed a network of initiatory cults active across the Mediterranean. In Magna Graecia, southern Italy, they appear in the same cemeteries as Pythagorean burials, hinting at overlapping philosophies of purification and the immortality of the soul. In Crete, the texts refer to Dionysus and Persephone, linking the Orphic mysteries with Dionysiac worship. These connections suggest that Orphism was less an organised religion than a collection of secret teachings passed through small circles of devotees. One of the most detailed tablets found in Paulina reads like a dialogue between the soul and the guardians of the afterlife. It directs the initiate to proclaim identity as a divine being, to avoid certain paths, and to approach Persephone with reverence. The sequence echoes ritual catechisms, rehearsed phrases meant to prove spiritual knowledge. Mistaking the words would mean losing the way. Because the texts were buried with the dead, they survived largely undisturbed for over 2,000 years. When excavated, their gold surface still gleamed, though the letters often required magnification to read. Modern imaging has revealed faint traces of punctuation and corrections, showing how carefully each phrase was chosen. Scholars compare them to initiation oaths or oral formulas whispered during mystery rites. The philosophical background of the tablets reflects the Orphic vision of cosmic kinship. The soul, born from the ashes of the Titans who devoured Dionysus, carries both divine and mortal elements. Through ritual purity and secret knowledge, it seeks to free itself from the cycle of death and rebirth. The lamellae, therefore, are not simply funerary ornaments, but condensed expressions of an entire worldview, one that treated death as a test of memory. Each discovery adds to the mosaic of this underground tradition. From the Ionian Islands to Macedonia and Sicily, the gold slips repeat the same key idea, that salvation depends on remembering. The soul must recall the sacred words, recognize its origin, and speak the formula at the right moment. Forgetfulness is the only true death. Memory is immortality. Found folded in tombs and read under magnifying glass today, the Orphic gold tablets preserve one of humanity's earliest written attempts to prepare consciously for the journey beyond. They are voices from believers who trusted that knowledge, inscribed in gold whispered through centuries, could light the way through darkness. Herculaneum Papyri, 79 CE eruption, unearthed in 18th C. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it buried not only Pompeii and its people, but also a seaside villa in the nearby town of Herculaneum. Inside that villa was a small library, shelves filled with papyrus scrolls. The volcanic ash and gas turned them into blackened cylinders of carbon, fusing the layers together so tightly that for centuries they were thought to be lumps of coal. What no one knew then was that this library was the only complete literary collection to survive from the ancient world. The villa, now called the Villa of the Papyri, was uncovered by accident in the mid-18th century. Miners digging tunnels for marble in 1752 hit walls decorated with bronze statues and mosaics, and among the rubble they found dozens of strange charred rolls. When one was cut open, it revealed faint traces of Greek letters. Scholars realized they were holding something extraordinary. Papyrus scrolls carbonized, not burned to ash, by the heat of the eruption. Opening them was another story. The papyri were as fragile as burnt paper. They shattered at the lightest touch. Early attempts to unroll them destroyed many. Monks and antiquarians in Naples tried slicing, steaming, and gluing the rolls, hoping to reveal their contents. One priest, Father Antonio Piaggio, devised a slow mechanical device using silk threads to peel the layers apart millimetre by millimetre. The process took months for a single scroll. The results were uneven, but for the first time in history, words emerged from a library entombed for nearly 1,700 years. Most of the readable texts turned out to be in Greek, many written by the philosopher Philodemus of Gadara, a follower of Epicurus. His works dealt with ethics, poetry, and the nature of the gods. This confirmed that the villa's owner was likely an educated Roman with Greek tastes, possibly the father-in-law of Julius Caesar, Lucius Calpurnius Piso. The setting matched what ancient writers described as a luxurious retreat near the Bay of Naples, filled with art and philosophical discussion. Over the years, more than 1,800 papyrus rolls have been identified from the site. Many remain unopened. still resembling chunks of coal stacked in museum drawers. Their surfaces are cracked, warped, and compressed by volcanic debris. Traditional methods can no longer be used without destroying them. For 2 centuries, the library remained partly mute, its secrets locked within its carbon shell. Modern technology, however, has begun to change that. Since the early 2000s, researchers have used multispectral and X-ray phase contrast imaging to peer inside the scrolls without unrolling them. The technique can detect subtle differences in density between carbonized papyrus and carbon-based ink, revealing letters hidden within the layers. The Herculaneum Papyri project and the Vesuvius Challenge, funded by private and academic initiatives, have combined machine learning and digital reconstruction to read scrolls virtually. In 2023, researchers succeeded in deciphering entire passages of Greek text from a still-sealed roll, words unseen since the Roman Empire. What they read was philosophical writing about pleasure and perception, consistent with the teachings of Epicurus. It argued that the highest good was not indulgence but freedom from pain and anxiety, echoing the Epicurean motto of living quietly and rationally. For the first time, a scroll that had never been unrolled gave up its contents through digital light instead of knives or steam. The library itself must once have been an elegant space. Long shelves, wooden boxes, and painted plaster walls. Excavations show that the papyri were stored in the villa's west wing, near a peristyle garden overlooking the sea. The eruption buried the building under nearly 20 meters of volcanic mud, sealing it in an airtight tomb. The same pyroclastic flow that killed the inhabitants preserved everything organic: wood, food, and the papyri themselves. The carbonization process created perfect molds of the scrolls, making them paradoxically indestructible and unreadable at the same time. The writing on the opened scrolls varies from neat professional hands to quick personal copies. Some bear corrections, marginal notes, or marks suggesting they were teaching copies. Others contain poetry, including works attributed to Chrysippus and other philosophers, though their titles remain uncertain. Latin scrolls have been found too, though their ink is harder to distinguish from the papyrus, leaving much still unread. For decades, the fragments recovered from unrolled scrolls were stored in glass frames at the National Library of Naples, each fragment like a puzzle piece of ancient thought. Scholars photographed them, traced the letters by hand, and compiled transcriptions. Modern infrared imaging later revealed faint ink invisible to the eye, restoring lost lines. Each new technique brought the texts closer to legibility, but most of the collection remains unexplored, a library still in the dark. Every new image reveals more of a world silenced in an instant by Vesuvius. What lies unread inside the remaining rolls, histories, plays, unknown works of philosophy, continues to drive the painstaking efforts to see through the black. In the fragments already visible, the handwriting of ancient thinkers still curls across the papyrus fibers, preserved by fire, waiting for light to finish what the eruption began. Oxyrhynchus Papyri, excavations 1896 to 1907. In the winter of 1896, 2 young Oxford scholars, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, arrived in the Egyptian desert town of Oxyrhynchus, a place long abandoned, its ruins half buried in sand. What drew them there was not treasure or temples, but rubbish, the mounds of discarded papyri left behind by centuries of daily life. Beneath layers of dust and broken pottery, the city's ancient trash heaps had become one of the greatest archives of the ancient world. With the sun beating down, local workers dug through the dry soil, pulling out fragile sheets and fragments. Even after 1,500 years, the papyrus fibers remained intact, preserved by Egypt's arid climate. Grenfell and Hunt quickly realized what they had found. Not a handful of documents, but thousands. Contracts, letters, tax receipts, poems, and plays. Over the next decade, they would uncover hundreds of thousands of fragments, filling crates that would eventually be shipped back to Oxford. Each piece was written in ink so faint it could barely be seen. Some were rolled scrolls, others torn scraps from books. Most were in Greek, the language of Egypt during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Others appeared in Latin, Coptic, and even early Arabic. What astonished scholars was the range of subjects. Among mundane records of sales and marriage agreements lay fragments of lost literature. Works of Sophocles, Euripides, Menander, and Sappho, once thought gone forever. One small scrap revealed lines from Euclid's Elements, Another contained verses from Homer in a hand different from any known manuscript. There were fragments of comedies, oracles, and philosophical treatises. Even more startling were early Christian writings, portions of Gospels, prayers, and sayings of Jesus not found in the New Testament. Some matched known texts, others were completely new, showing how varied early Christian thought once was. The sheer quantity of papyri was overwhelming. By the time excavations ended in 1907, Grenfell and Hunt had filled hundreds of boxes. Each contained piles of fragments, labelled and shipped to Britain for study. The work of reading them was slow, almost microscopic. Every scrap had to be cleaned, flattened, and identified by hand. The two scholars published dozens of volumes, but their task outlived them. More than a century later, most of the fragments remain unpublished, stored in climate-controlled rooms at Oxford's Sackler Library. The Oxyrhynchus Papyri, as they came to be called, represent a cross-section of life in Greco-Roman Egypt. There are private letters between families, petitions to officials, lists of taxes, invitations to dinner parties, recipes, and even jokes. Through them, historians have reconstructed how ordinary people lived, their rents, diets, and disputes. But among these ordinary voices also appear the faint echoes of ancient teachers and poets. Some fragments preserve unknown tragedies, others new poems from Pindar or Simonides. Each small piece can shift our understanding of classical literature. Physically, the papyri are brown, brittle, and often no larger than a coin. Their ink, carbon-based, can still be recovered under special light. Modern imaging techniques, multispectral photography, and infrared scanning now reveal letters invisible to the naked eye. Researchers combine these with digital reconstruction, matching edges and fibres like a giant puzzle. A fragment found in one box may connect with another discovered a century earlier. Slowly, the scrolls and books of Oxyrhynchus are being reassembled line by line. One of the most remarkable finds came early in the project. A fragment containing sayings of Jesus introduced by the phrase, "Jesus said." At first, Grenfell thought it belonged to an unknown gospel, and decades later it was recognised as part of the Gospel of Thomas, the same text later found in full at Nag Hammadi. Other Christian writings include apocryphal Gospels, hymns, and early copies of canonical ones, some of the oldest surviving witnesses to the New Testament. The papyri also preserve glimpses of lost works of philosophy, including Stoic and Epicurean texts, and fragments attributed to early historians. One scroll preserves part of an unknown play by Sophocles. Another shows how scribes formatted and corrected texts in ancient schools. The discoveries expanded not only what is known, but how scholars understand the transmission of knowledge itself. The task of cataloguing the collection continues to this day. Over 5,000 texts have been published, but the majority remain unread, sealed in boxes and folders under layers of numbering and notes. Each year, scholars and students open new fragments, sometimes revealing nothing more than a shopping list. Other times, a verse unseen since antiquity. What began as the excavation of a forgotten city became a rescue of an entire civilization's written memory. The papyri of Oxyrhynchus, pulled from ancient garbage heaps, still whisper through time, traces of voices, prayers, and arguments that refuse to vanish under the desert sun. Corpus Hermeticum, Asclepius, Greek, Latin, Hermetica. In the closing centuries of the ancient world, as the old temples of Egypt and Greece faded under the rise of new empires and new faiths, a series of writings began to circulate quietly among scholars and initiates. They were written in Greek, later in Latin, and claimed to record dialogues between the god Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, and his disciples. These texts came to be known collectively as the Hermetica, the core of which includes the Corpus Hermeticum and the Asclepius. They blended philosophy, religion, and mysticism into one vision of a universe alive with divine intelligence. The Hermetica emerged in late antiquity, around the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, probably in Egypt under Roman rule. They drew on Egyptian theology, Greek philosophy, and Near Eastern spirituality. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus united the Egyptian god Thoth, patron of wisdom and writing, with the Greek Hermes, messenger of the gods. The writings were composed as conversations, Hermes instructing a student, often named Tat or Asclepius, about the nature of the cosmos, the soul, and the path to spiritual rebirth. The Corpus Hermeticum consists of 17 short treatises. The first, called the Poimandris, begins with a vision. Hermes encounters a divine being of boundless light who reveals how the universe came to be. The text describes creation as a descent of divine mind into matter and humanity's calling to remember its origin. It presents a world in which everything, stars, gods, humans, is bound by the same living spirit. The message is one of revelation through knowledge or gnosis. By understanding the divine order, a person awakens to their own immortal nature. Other books of the corpus expand on this theme. They discuss the structure of the heavens, the harmony of the planets, and the way the human body mirrors the cosmos. The tone alternates between philosophy and prayer. The texts borrow from Plato's Timaeus, from Stoicism, and from older Egyptian priestly hymns. They describe God as a single ineffable source, not anthropomorphic, but pure mind. Humans, according to Hermes, are divine beings trapped in physical form, and salvation comes through inner enlightenment, not ritual sacrifice. The Asclepius, preserved mainly in Latin translation, continues the dialogue but focuses more on divine power within the material world. It describes the creation of statues animated by spirit, the ensouled images that Egyptian priests believed could house gods. It speaks of the fall of temples and the coming of a time when Egypt's religion would vanish, a prophecy that later readers saw as an echo of their own age. The Asclepius circulated widely in the Roman world, often copied by scholars interested in astrology, alchemy, and sacred magic. By the Middle Ages, the Greek Hermetica had disappeared from the West, surviving only in Byzantine manuscripts and Arabic commentaries. The Latin Asclepius remained known, read by Christian theologians like Augustine, who saw in it traces of pagan wisdom but also signs of dangerous pride. The Hermetic vision, that humans could share in divine creation, conflicted with later Orthodox theology, and the texts slipped into obscurity. Their return came suddenly in 1463, when a manuscript of the Greek Hermetica reached Florence. The patron Cosimo de' Medici, fascinated by the promise of ancient wisdom older than Plato, ordered his translator Marsilio Ficino to set aside his work on Plato and translate the new texts immediately. Ficino did so within months, producing the first Latin version of the Corpus Hermeticum. It was printed and circulated across Europe, sparking what became known as the Hermetic Revival. To Renaissance thinkers, the Hermetica seemed to preserve a primordial revelation, a theology given to humanity before Moses or Christ. Scholars believed Hermes Trismegistus to be a real sage from Egypt's earliest days, the father of philosophy and science. Artists, alchemists, and astronomers all drew inspiration from his teachings. Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Giordano Bruno saw in them a bridge between reason and divinity, between the physical world and the eternal. Only in the 17th century did historians realize the texts were products of the early Roman period, not prehistoric Egypt. Yet even then, their influence persisted. The Hermetica had already shaped the language of Renaissance humanism, the rise of alchemy, and the birth of early modern science. The manuscripts themselves survive in scattered forms. Greek codices in Paris, Florence, and Venice, Latin copies of the Asclepius in monasteries and private collections. Some show marginal notes from monks and scholars debating whether Hermes was a prophet or a magician. Their survival owes as much to curiosity as to devotion. The Hermetica occupy a rare place between religion and philosophy. Dialogues written when the boundaries between both were fluid. In their pages the cosmos breathes, the planets sing, and the soul, through knowledge, remembers what it truly is. Hidden in libraries for centuries, translated and retranslated, they continue to speak with the same quiet conviction that understanding the divine order is the highest form of worship. Cologne Mani Codex, Egypt, published 1970s. In the late 1960s, archaeologists working in Egypt's desert sands came across a small, crumbling package of parchment, no larger than a man's hand. The fragments were dark, stuck together, and wrapped in linen. Inside lay a tiny book, written in Greek, barely legible after 16 centuries of burial. When conservators separated the pages, they realized they were looking at one of the rarest finds in the history of religious manuscripts, the Cologne Mani Codex, a miniature biography of the prophet Mani, founder of the religion known as Manichaeism. The codex dates from the 5th century CE and it was discovered in Egypt, though its exact provenance remains uncertain, likely from a grave or a cache of religious texts buried to protect them. Despite its small size, only a few centimetres wide, it contained 4 folded quires of parchment, with about 17 pages still intact. The text was written in tiny Greek uncial letters, often with 2 columns per page. Each line had to be magnified to be read. When scholars began restoring it in the 1970s, the parchment was brittle and fused by humidity. Every sheet had to be softened, cleaned, and flattened before it could be photographed. The fragments were carefully arranged, forming a coherent narrative. The resulting edition, published by the University of Cologne, revealed something that no historian had seen before: an autobiographical account of Mani's youth, told by his earliest followers, centuries before later sources reshaped his image. Mani, born in Mesopotamia around 216 CE, was the founder of a world religion that once stretched from the Roman Empire to China. His teachings combined elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, describing a cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Before the discovery of the Cologne Codex, most of what was known about him came from hostile Christian and Muslim writers who labelled him a heretic. The tiny Greek book provided a voice from within his own circle, one that described not doctrine but formation. The Codex opens with a description of Mani's family and his youth among a Baptist sect known as the Elkosites, a Jewish Christian community that practiced ritual purification and vegetarianism. It portrays Mani as a contemplative child marked early by visions of a divine twin, a spiritual companion who revealed to him secrets about the world. The text explains that this heavenly guide, called the Syzygoes, appeared to Mani and instructed him to separate from his community, to purify himself, and to prepare for his mission as a messenger of light. The narrative alternates between story and reflection. At times, the language echoes early Christian writings. At others, it slips into the symbolic tone of Gnostic revelation. The author, likely one of Mani's disciples, presents his master as the final prophet in a line that includes Adam, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus. It claims that Mani's revelation unites all previous truths into a single system. These ideas later shaped the Manichaean Church, which spread across continents before being suppressed in the Middle Ages. The physical manuscript preserves traces of its use. The parchment shows folding marks, suggesting it was carried as a pocketbook, perhaps by a believer or a missionary. Its compact size made it easy to conceal, an advantage for a movement often persecuted by Roman and later Christian authorities. The neat Greek handwriting shows the work of a trained scribe, possibly copying an older Syriac original. Margins and punctuation marks were added later, likely by monks who tried to preserve or repurpose the text. The discovery's significance lay not only in its content, but in its survival. Greek Manichaean texts are almost non-existent. Most surviving Manichaean literature comes from Coptic, Middle Persian, or Chinese manuscripts found much later in Central Asia. The Cologne Mani Codex filled an early gap, showing that Mani's followers produced Greek translations for use in Egypt, where Manichaeism had a strong presence in the 4th and 5th centuries. The Codex's conservation took years. The fragments were stabilized, photographed under different light filters, and gradually deciphered. Some words were restored letter by letter from overlapping layers of ink. The editors, Lutecuisen and Koenen, published the complete transcription in 1988, followed by critical studies that placed the text at the heart of early Manichaean formation. The handwriting and vocabulary confirm that it was written by Greek-speaking believers, probably in a monastic setting along the Nile. Passages from the Codex reveal a reflective, almost intimate tone. Mani's visions are described in the first person, moments of fear, wonder, and enlightenment. His withdrawal from the Elkosites is presented as both physical and spiritual, a turning point leading him to declare a universal message of liberation from darkness. The narrative ends before his public ministry begins, making the Codex not a gospel but a prelude, a glimpse of the prophet before he became one. After its restoration, the tiny book was placed in the collection of the University of Cologne, where it remains preserved in controlled conditions. It measures barely 4 centimeters across, a fragment of parchment that contains the earliest first-hand story of one of history's most controversial visionaries. From the sands of Egypt to the microscopes of modern scholars, its survival is almost miraculous, a relic of a vanished religion that once dreamed of uniting the world in light. Turfan Manichaean Manuscripts, Xinjiang Oases, early 1900s. At the edge of China's vast Taklamakan Desert, where the ancient Silk Road once split into northern and southern routes, lie the ruins of forgotten oasis cities, places like Turfan, Kocho, and Dunhuang. It was here, buried in sand and cave shrines, that explorers in the early 1900s uncovered fragments of a religion long thought extinct. The texts they found were written in strange scripts, Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, even Chinese, and all carried the same unmistakable name, Mani. These were the Turfan Manichaean manuscripts, the scattered remains of a faith that had once stretched from the Roman Empire to the borders of China before being hunted to near extinction. The story of how these manuscripts survived begins centuries earlier. Manichaeism, founded in the 3rd century by the Persian prophet Mani, spread rapidly through trade routes linking Mesopotamia, Persia, and Central Asia. Its message was universal, a cosmic struggle between the forces of light and darkness, mirrored within the human soul. The faith adopted local languages wherever it went. By the 7th century, Manichaean communities existed in Iran, Samarkand, and Western China. When the Uyghur Empire rose in the 8th century, its rulers briefly adopted Manichaeism as a state religion. For a moment, the teachings of Mani, once banned in the West, became imperial doctrine in the East. But the empire fell in the 9th century, and with it Manichaeism entered a long twilight. Persecuted by both Buddhists and Muslims, its temples were abandoned, its priests dispersed. Yet in the dry caves and ruined monasteries of Turfan, in what is now the Xinjiang region of China, their scriptures remained hidden, rolled, stacked, and sealed in walls. The desert preserved them in silence for nearly 1,000 years. In the early 20th century, European expeditions searching for ancient texts along the Silk Road began to uncover them. German archaeologists, led by Albert von Lecoq and Albert Grunwedel, reached Turfan in 1902 following rumours of painted caves and buried manuscripts. Digging through sand-filled stupas and collapsed temples, they found boxes of manuscripts written on paper and parchment. Some were in pristine condition, others reduced to shreds. When deciphered, they revealed hymns, prayers, psalms, and sermons, all unmistakably Manichaean. Among the discoveries were illustrated scrolls showing Mani surrounded by rays of light, painted in vivid reds and golds. There were fragments of the Book of Giants, a text that retold parts of the Book of Enoch within the Manichaean cosmology. Other pieces contained letters and liturgies describing rituals, confessions, and meditations on the soul's release from matter. The combination of languages showed how far the religion had travelled, from Syriac and Middle Persian roots to Chinese translation, often blending terms from Buddhism and Taoism. The manuscripts spoke in the voice of a community both global and persecuted. One hymn, written in Sogdian, praises the Father of Greatness and mourns the soul trapped in the body, praying for liberation through knowledge and purity. Another Chinese text uses the term Buddha of Light for Mani, showing how local converts had merged his identity with Buddhist vocabulary. These texts made clear that, even after centuries of suppression, Manichaean groups in Central Asia had remained active until at least the 13th century. The German teams shipped hundreds of fragments back to Berlin, where they were stored in the Museum für Asiatische Kunst. There, scholars spent decades sorting, cleaning, and cataloguing them. Many were written on thin paper tinted pink or yellow, and their ink still glimmered under light. Some pieces were only a few centimetres wide, requiring reconstruction from dozens of slivers. Together, they revealed one of the richest caches of Manichaean material ever found, more extensive than any in the West. Their survival is due almost entirely to the desert climate of the Turfan Basin, one of the driest places on Earth. The sand protected them from decay, and the isolation of the region kept them safe from political destruction. But their rediscovery came at a cost. During the wars of the 20th century, many fragments stored in Berlin were lost or damaged. Others survived in photographs and tracings, which are still being used today to digitally restore the lost pages. Linguists and historians continue to study the texts, comparing them with the earlier Cologne Mani Codex and other finds from Egypt and Iran. Together, they form a continuous record of a religion that once called itself the final revelation of all faiths. Through these delicate sheets of parchment, written in languages that bridged continents, the story of Mani and his followers re-emerged from the sands, not as myth, but as history preserved by accident and rescued by persistence. Dunhuang Library Cave Manuscripts, sealed, Cave 17, C. 11th C. In the far reaches of northwestern China, at the edge of the Gobi Desert, stands a cliff face pierced with hundreds of caves. This is Mogao near the oasis town of Dunhuang, once a key stop on the Silk Road. In the early 11th century, one of these chambers, now known as Cave 17, was sealed and forgotten. Behind its painted walls lay thousands of manuscripts, scrolls and paintings, stacked in bundles from floor to ceiling. For 900 years the cave remained untouched, its entrance plastered over and disguised among the others. When it was finally opened around 1900, the discovery stunned the world. The man who found it was Wang Yuanlu, a Taoist monk and self-appointed guardian of the caves. While clearing sand from a corridor, he noticed a blocked doorway. Behind it, he uncovered a hidden chamber packed tightly with scrolls wrapped in silk and hemp cloth. The dry desert air had preserved them almost perfectly. Wang realized at once that this was no ordinary storeroom. Some scrolls bore imperial seals, others Buddhist sutras written in beautiful calligraphy. There were paintings on linen, banners, and wooden tablets. The collection had been untouched since the Song dynasty. News of the discovery spread slowly but reached foreign explorers making their way through Central Asia. In 1907, the British-Hungarian archaeologist Aurel Stein visited Dunhuang and persuaded Wang to sell him a selection of the manuscripts. A year later, the French sinologist Paul Pelliot arrived and spent weeks examining the texts by lamplight. Between them, and later Russian, Japanese and Chinese expeditions, thousands of manuscripts left the cave for museums in London, Paris, St. Petersburg and Beijing. What they revealed was a snapshot of an entire world, the religious, political and cultural life of the Silk Road in its golden age. The Dunhuang manuscripts include more than 40,000 items written in a dozen languages: Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Khotanese, Sogdian, Uyghur, and even Hebrew. They cover subjects as wide as Buddhist scriptures, Confucian classics, Taoist treatises, astronomy, medicine, music, contracts, letters, and local government records. There are calendars, prayers for travellers, diagrams of monasteries, and school textbooks. The variety reflects Dunhuang's position as a crossroads of civilizations, where Indian monks, Chinese scribes, Persian merchants, and Tibetan officials all met. One of the most remarkable finds was a printed scroll known as the Diamond Sutra, dated to 868 CE. It is the world's oldest known printed book with a precise date. The scroll measures over 5 meters long and is printed from carved wooden blocks. At the beginning it bears the dedication of a man named Wang Jie, who commissioned it for the spiritual benefit of his parents. The text itself is one of the core teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, emphasizing the impermanence of all things and the emptiness of form. The survival of this scroll rewrote the history of printing, proving that the technique flourished in China centuries before it appeared in Europe. Many of the manuscripts show signs of everyday use. Some scrolls have patches or repairs, others are covered with fingerprints and notes. Monks and scribes copied texts by hand on reused paper, sometimes writing over old documents. Certain scrolls include miniature illustrations or notes in the margins explaining difficult passages. The diversity of handwriting suggests that the cave stored material from several monasteries in the area, perhaps gathered for safekeeping during a time of unrest. Why the cave was sealed remains uncertain. Some scholars believe the cache was hidden during the Tibetan occupation of Dunhuang in the 9th century. Others think it was simply a monastic archive closed when space ran out. The doorway was plastered and painted over, blending seamlessly with the surrounding walls. Whatever the reason, the act preserved a time capsule of medieval life along the Silk Road. The physical state of the manuscripts today tells a story of both fragility and endurance. Silk scrolls shimmer with faded colours, paper documents crumble at the touch. Yet the writing, made from carbon ink, remains clear. Some scrolls are more than 10 meters long, others barely palm-sized. The calligraphy varies from elegant clerical scripts to hurried cursive lines. The collection even includes letters between soldiers and their families, showing the human side of a frontier outpost once buzzing with caravans and pilgrims. Today the manuscripts are dispersed across the world, housed mainly in the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and institutes in China. Scholars have spent over a century cataloguing, restoring and digitizing them through the international Dunhuang program, which reunites the collection virtually. High-resolution scans allow researchers to examine texts that once lay in darkness for almost a millennium. The discovery of the Dunhuang Library Cave remains one of the greatest archaeological finds in the study of ancient manuscripts. Sealed away beneath desert cliffs, the scrolls captured the voices of monks, travellers, poets and kings who passed along the Silk Road. Among them, the printed Diamond Sutra still unfurls its ancient pages, a witness to the first flowering of printing and the enduring power of words preserved by sand and silence. Guodian Slips, Warring States Tomb Open 1993. In the summer of 1993, construction workers near the town of Guodian, in China's Hubei province, were digging at the edge of a hill when their shovels struck a cluster of wooden coffins. Archaeologists arrived quickly and uncovered what turned out to be an ancient tomb from the Warring States period, around 300 BCE. Inside, among bronze vessels and lacquerware, they found bundles of thin, dark bamboo strips tied together with decayed string. Each strip was etched with rows of tiny Chinese characters, a text written long before paper existed. When the bindings were lifted, the strips fell apart, scattering across the table like dried reeds. What they held would soon change the understanding of early Chinese philosophy. The tomb belonged to a minor noble or scholar, buried during the final decades of the state of Chu, one of the great regional powers before China's unification. The humid soil had preserved more than 800 bamboo slips, the standard writing medium of the time. Their surfaces were blackened with age, but still legible under light. Conservators dried, cleaned, and numbered every fragment, reassembling them into coherent texts. Once restored, the slips revealed a collection of writings, essays, dialogues, and sayings, including the earliest known version of the Laozi, also known as the Tao Te Ching. Before this discovery, scholars had relied on Han Dynasty copies of the Tao Te Ching written centuries later. The Guodian slips pushed the text's existence back to within a few generations of its supposed author, Laozi. The bamboo version lacked some later chapters and variations, showing that the work circulated in shorter independent sections before being compiled. Its sentences were familiar yet subtly different, simpler, less polished and closer to oral teaching. The famous lines about the way that can be spoken and the nameless origin of heaven and earth appeared beside sayings absent from any other version. The Guodian find also included other philosophical works. Among them were texts related to Confucian thought, such as the Sayings of Confucius, fragments of the Book of Rites, and dialogues about virtue, governance, and moral cultivation. There were also writings that seemed to blend ideas from both Confucian and Taoist traditions, suggesting that the sharp divisions drawn by later scholars did not yet exist. The tomb's occupant may have been a tutor or court scholar who studied multiple schools of thought at once. Each bamboo strip measures about 27 centimeters long and 1 centimeter wide, with characters written vertically in black ink. The slips were originally tied in order to form long scrolls that could be rolled and stored. The strings had long since decayed, so one of the most difficult tasks was determining the correct sequence. Archaeologists and philologists spent years comparing handwriting, grammar, and word patterns to reconstruct the original order. Some texts were clearly complete, others were fragmentary, surviving only in sections. The process of preservation was delicate. After cleaning, each slip was mounted between thin sheets of glass for study. Infrared photography helped reveal faded ink, while digital scans allowed for virtual reconstruction. The characters themselves show the elegant curved style of Chu script, distinct from the later standardized Chinese forms. Every stroke provides insight into the regional writing traditions of the Warring States. The bamboo texts give a rare glimpse into how knowledge circulated before the invention of paper. They show that philosophical ideas were transmitted as portable bundles of strips, copied by hand and shared among scholars. Some of the Guodian writings discuss the cultivation of the self and the harmony between ruler and subject. Others reflect on the cosmic order and the unity of opposites, the same duality that would later define Taoist cosmology. The mixture of political and spiritual themes suggests that philosophy then was not separated from governance or daily life. The presence of both Taoist and Confucian ideas in the same tomb has led historians to believe that early Chinese thinkers did not yet see their teachings as rival systems. Instead, they explored overlapping questions about morality, order, and the way. The Guodian texts capture this early stage of Chinese thought, when ideas were still forming, circulating among students and courts, carried on strips of bamboo that passed from hand to hand. Today, the Guodian choose slips are housed at Wuhan University, where they are kept in controlled temperature and humidity. Scholars continue to study and publish new transcriptions. Some researchers have found evidence that the tomb's owner may have been connected to the philosopher Zisi, Confucius's grandson, whose teachings influenced both early Confucian and Taoist lines. If true, the tomb represents a bridge between traditions later seen as separate, preserved not in ink on paper, but in the faint brushstrokes across narrow bamboo, sealed for more than 2,000 years beneath the soil of Chu. Mawangdui Silk Manuscripts, Han Tombs, 1973. In the winter of 1973, a team of Chinese archaeologists opened a tomb complex buried beneath an unassuming hill near Mawangdui, on the outskirts of Changsha in Hunan province. What they found inside would become one of the most extraordinary discoveries in Chinese archaeology. A sealed set of elite burials from the early Western Han dynasty, untouched since around 168 BCE. Hidden within, rolled tightly in lacquer boxes and silk wrappings, were texts written not on bamboo or wood, but on silk itself, manuscripts that had lain undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. The tombs belonged to the Marquis of Dai, Li Kang, his wife Lady Dai, Xin Jui, and their son. Each tomb was a self-contained world, stocked with everything needed for eternity: furniture, food, clothing, and a library of knowledge meant to accompany the dead. Among these offerings, the archaeologists found dozens of silk scrolls filled with dense lines of ink, remarkably preserved in the airtight chambers. These became known as the Mawangdui silk manuscripts, and they offered a window into the scientific and philosophical mind of early imperial China. The scrolls covered a range of subjects: philosophy, medicine, astronomy, geography, and ritual, showing how unified knowledge was in the early Han worldview. The most celebrated of these texts were two early versions of the Laozi, also known as the Tao Te Ching. Before this discovery, scholars had relied only on copies written centuries later. The Mawangdui versions predated them by hundreds of years, providing the earliest surviving form of the work attributed to Laozi, the legendary sage of the Tao. In these silk copies, the order of the two main sections is reversed. The Deijing, or Book of Virtue, comes before the Daojing, or Book of the Way. The text itself contains shorter, less refined versions of familiar passages. Some verses use different characters or phrasing, suggesting that the Tao Te Ching circulated in oral and regional forms before becoming standardized. The discovery also confirmed that early Taoism was not yet a fixed philosophy, but a collection of teachings evolving through time and place. The same tombs that preserved the philosophical scrolls also contained manuscripts on medicine, the earliest known Chinese medical writings on silk. They include the prescriptions for 52 ailments, a catalogue of remedies using herbs, minerals, and animal parts, many of which are still recognized in traditional medicine today. Another text describes Daoyin exercises, the precursors of modern Qigong, showing illustrated movements meant to harmonize breath, posture, and internal energy. These documents reveal a sophisticated understanding of anatomy, disease, and the connection between body and cosmos. One group of silk scrolls presents a detailed cosmological system that links human health, the seasons, and the elements of nature. They describe the balance of yin and yang, the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, and the cycles that govern both natural phenomena and human life. Another text outlines methods of divination and astronomy, charting stars and celestial movements. A separate manuscript contains one of the earliest maps ever discovered in China, drawn with precise lines showing rivers, mountains, and territories, demonstrating that the Han elite viewed geography as part of a broader cosmic order. The physical condition of the manuscripts made their recovery a race against time. When first unwrapped, the silk was damp and fragile, its ink beginning to fade. Conservators worked in controlled conditions to dry and flatten each scroll before the air could destroy it. The writing was done with a fine brush, in the clerical script typical of the early Han period, with characters spaced evenly across the fabric. Some scrolls are over 2 meters long, others survive only in pieces. Despite the age, the brushwork remains sharp, proof of the skill of the scribes who copied them. The tombs themselves were masterpieces of preservation. Each was built more than 15 meters underground, sealed with layers of charcoal and white clay that kept out moisture and oxygen. In the deepest chamber, Lady Di's body was found in a state of preservation so extraordinary that scientists were able to examine her skin, organs and blood vessels as if she had been buried only recently. The same conditions that protected her also preserved the manuscripts, silk and ink surviving side by side with lacquer bowls and woven garments. Together, the Mawangdui manuscripts reveal how the early Han viewed knowledge as an integrated whole. Medicine, philosophy and astronomy were not separate disciplines, but expressions of the same principle, the search for balance between heaven, earth and humanity. Each text, written by hand on silk, represents both intellectual effort and ritual devotion. For the Marquis of Dai and his family, these writings were not mere possessions. They were guides for the soul, as much a part of eternity as the food and treasures buried alongside them. Today, the manuscripts are kept in the Hunan Provincial Museum, where they continue to be studied, photographed, and restored. Their discovery reshaped the understanding of ancient Chinese thought, not through myth or legend, but through the quiet endurance of ink and silk sealed in darkness for 2 millennia. Shuihudi Qin Bamboo Slips, Tomb, 1975. In December 1975, in the quiet farmland near Yunmeng County, in Hubei province, construction workers digging foundations came across a cluster of ancient wooden coffins. Archaeologists were called, and what they unearthed turned out to be one of the most significant discoveries for understanding the Qin dynasty, the first imperial power to unify China. Inside one of the tombs, belonging to a mid-level official named Xiaohu Shuang, lay bundles of bamboo slips, hundreds of narrow strips tied together by decayed cords. They had been buried for over 2,000 years, sealed since around 217 BCE, during the reign of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. When conservators separated the sticks and cleaned away the soil, they realized they were looking at the bureaucratic backbone of an empire. Each slip measured about 25 centimeters long, with fine black ink written vertically down the surface. Together they formed administrative records, laws and handbooks, the Shuihudi Qin bamboo slips. Unlike philosophical or literary works, these texts dealt with the machinery of rule, how officials kept order, punished crime and managed soldiers and civilians across the new empire. Before their discovery, almost nothing concrete was known about how Qin law operated beyond brief mentions in historical chronicles. Once the bamboo was dried and restored, scholars identified over 1,100 slips. The handwriting was uniform and careful, showing that they had been written by trained scribes. Some were bound into rolls, others were stacked flat inside lacquered boxes. They were placed beside the tomb's occupant as both personal property and professional record, reflecting his life as an official under Qin administration. The texts were divided into several categories: laws, legal case examples, administrative codes, and manuals on daily conduct. Among the most important is a collection known as the Statutes and Ordinances of the Qin, Qinlu Ji Jiao, which details the empire's judicial system. It includes articles on theft, murder, tax collection, property registration, and the obligations of local magistrates. The laws are precise, often prescribing fixed penalties measured in ranks or labour sentences. Some slips describe punishments such as forced labour on frontier walls, confiscation of property, or demotion of officials for negligence. The tone is practical rather than moral, aimed at uniformity and efficiency. These laws help transform a collection of warring states into a centralised empire ruled through regulation instead of personal allegiance. Another section, called the Book of Questions and Answers, contains dialogues between an instructor and officials in training. It presents case studies, hypothetical situations where a local magistrate must decide how to apply the law. The questions test knowledge of procedure, what to do if a soldier deserts, how to record taxes correctly, or how to distinguish negligence from intent. The format resembles a bureaucratic manual, evidence of how Qin officials were educated to think in legal terms. The Shuihudi texts also include the calendar of duties, a schedule assigning daily responsibilities throughout the lunar year. It specifies when officials should hold meetings, inspect prisoners, record harvests, and conduct military drills. Another set of slips outlines measuring standards for grain, cloth, and currency, showing the Qin obsession with uniformity. the same policy that standardized writing, weights, and even axle widths across the empire. One fascinating group of slips preserves fragments of a personal notebook, listing medical prescriptions, funeral rituals, and everyday observations. These smaller texts blur the line between official record and private reflection, offering a glimpse of how literate administrators combined practical knowledge with belief. The presence of these notes among legal codes suggests that the official who owned them saw all writing as part of one continuous system, a tool for maintaining both order and harmony. The discovery process itself was delicate. The bamboo had softened from centuries underground. Each strip was removed using fine brushes and tweezers, then cleaned in alcohol to prevent decay. Once dried, they were placed between glass plates for study. Under infrared light, faded ink revealed characters invisible to the naked eye. The handwriting used small seal script, the same form standardized under the first emperor, making the Shwehudi slips the earliest surviving example of Qin bureaucratic script in practice. Together, the contents reconstruct the daily reality of Qin administration far beyond what chronicles record. They show how orders from the central capital reached distant counties, how taxes were calculated, and how even minor officials were bound by written law. The tone is firm, methodical, and often unforgiving, reflecting a world where precision and obedience were the foundation of stability. Today, the Shwehudi bamboo slips are preserved at the Hubei Provincial Museum, displayed in climate-controlled cases. Their darkened surfaces, lined with thousands of ancient characters, remain one of the few direct voices of the Qin state, a civilization that built the first Great Wall, unified script and currency, and vanished soon after its founder's death, leaving behind the written proof of how an empire functioned in ink, bamboo, and order. Coptic Manichaean Kephalaya, Medinet Madi, 1929. In the spring of 1929, archaeologists digging near the Egyptian village of Medinet Madi, southwest of Fayum, came upon fragments of parchment that had been sealed in the desert for more than 1,500 years. The site, an ancient settlement built during Roman rule, yielded several codices written in Coptic, the later form of the Egyptian language. The pages were blackened and brittle, but the lettering was still visible under the sand. When scholars cleaned and reassembled them, they realized they had uncovered a lost scripture from one of history's most persecuted religions, Manichaeism. The manuscripts became known as the Coptic Manichaean Codices, and among them was a text called the Kephalaya, meaning chapters or discourses. These were the doctrinal writings of the prophet Mani, the 3rd century visionary who sought to unite the teachings of Jesus, Zoroaster, and the Buddha into a single religion of light. For centuries his movement had been banned, its followers hunted from the Roman Empire to Persia and beyond. By the time these books were buried in Egypt, the religion had already been driven underground. The Kephalaya was unlike other religious writings of its time. Instead of a continuous narrative, it was arranged as a series of short chapters, lessons, sermons, and explanations. Each section began with a question posed to Mani by one of his disciples, followed by his response. The tone was didactic, almost conversational, intended for teaching new converts. The text explained the structure of the universe, the struggle between light and darkness, and the mission of the elect, the spiritual elite charged with freeing light from matter through knowledge and ritual. In the cosmology of Manichaeism, the world was a battleground. Fragments of divine light had been trapped within human bodies and physical matter when the powers of darkness invaded creation. Salvation, Mani taught, came through enlightenment and purity, through the separation of light from darkness by moral conduct, prayer, and vegetarian diet. The Kephalaya described this cosmic history in vivid imagery, portraying the heavens as vast fortresses of light, guarded by angels, while the lower realms swarmed with demonic forces. Unlike the Bible or the Quran, the Kephalaya did not speak of a single deity but of 2 eternal principles, light and darkness, locked in conflict. Its pages mapped the structure of existence, naming realms, rulers, and hierarchies. It also provided ethical instructions, how to live without harming living beings, how to speak truthfully, and how to honor the divine light within all creatures. For its followers, it was both scripture and manual, a guide to the inner struggle of the soul. The Coptic version found at Medinet Madi was written in the 4th or 5th century CE, when Manichaeism still had a strong presence in Egypt, particularly around the Fayum oasis. The manuscripts were carefully buried in sealed jars, likely hidden by monks during waves of persecution under Christian rulers. Alongside the Kephalaia, archaeologists found fragments of psalms, prayers and letters, forming a small monastic library. The dry desert air preserved them well enough for modern scholars to read most of the text. The discovery was made by a joint Italian-Egyptian expedition led by Achille Vogliano, who at first thought the codices were early Christian. Only later, after study in Cairo and Berlin, did experts recognize their Manichaean content. The pages, made of thick parchment, were bound in leather covers dyed red and black, decorated with simple geometric patterns. Inside, the Coptic text ran in neat lines across 2 columns, with titles marked in red ink. Translation of the Kephalaia revealed a complex and poetic theology. Mani's words are presented as direct teachings to his disciples, discussing topics such as the creation of the moon and sun, the origin of suffering, and the fate of the soul after death. Some chapters explain the role of the apostles who carried his message to other lands. Others retell the story of how light becomes trapped in plants and animals, the reason his followers avoided killing or eating meat. Every passage reinforces the same vision, a universe where spiritual forces move invisibly through all things. After their excavation, the manuscripts were transferred to Cairo and later studied by scholars across Europe. The Kephalaia became a cornerstone for reconstructing Manichaean doctrine, since so few of the religion's own writings had survived. Most earlier knowledge came from hostile Christian polemics. Here, for the first time, Mani's followers spoke in their own voice. Physically, the manuscripts are dark brown and fragile, their edges burned and broken. Conservators stabilized the parchment and photographed every page. Some sections were later identified as overlapping with fragments found in Central Asia, confirming how widely the same texts had once circulated. The words from the Fayum Desert connect directly to the later Manichaean communities in Turfan and beyond, proving that the religion's written tradition had crossed continents before vanishing into silence. Today, the surviving leaves of the Coptic Kephalaia are preserved in the Coptic Museum in Cairo and in European collections. They remain one of the few surviving examples of Manichaean scripture, buried to escape destruction, rediscovered by chance, and still carrying the voice of a religion that once dreamed of illuminating the world through the knowledge of light. Cairo Geniza Trove, Ben Ezra Synagogue, opened 1896. In the heart of Old Cairo, in a synagogue that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, there was once a small, hidden chamber sealed behind a wooden wall. For generations, no one entered it. The members of the Ben Ezra Synagogue knew what lay inside, a Geniza, a sacred storeroom where Jews placed any document that bore the name of God. According to tradition, such writings could not be destroyed or discarded. Over time, scraps of parchment, letters and scrolls accumulated there in silence. By the 19th century, the chamber was overflowing, a mountain of words sealed away from the world. In 1896, 2 travellers from Cambridge, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson, brought a handful of Hebrew fragments from Cairo to a scholar named Solomon Schechter. Among them, he recognised a lost piece of the Book of Ben Sira, an ancient text thought to survive only in Greek and Latin. Realising their value, Schechter travelled to Cairo later that year. When he entered the Ben Ezra Synagogue, he found what would become one of the most astonishing manuscript discoveries of modern times. Hundreds of thousands of fragments, untouched for centuries, packed floor to ceiling in a dark, airless room. The chamber's contents were not a single library but a city's memory. The Cairo Geniza held more than 400,000 manuscript pieces spanning 1,000 years of Jewish life, from the 9th to the 19th century. There were religious texts, business records, poetry, legal documents, medical prescriptions, marriage contracts, and personal letters. Some fragments were torn, others folded into packets or sewn into bindings. Many were written in Hebrew, but others used Aramaic, Judeo-Arabic, and even Persian or Greek. Every language that Jews of the medieval Mediterranean spoke found a place in that pile of papers. The Geniza had served a unique role. In Jewish law, once a text contained God's name, it became ritually sacred. When worn out or obsolete, it could not simply be thrown away. The Ben Ezra Synagogue, built in the 10th century, became a central repository for such materials. Scribes, scholars, and merchants alike placed their documents there, ensuring they would rest in sanctity rather than decay in the open. Over centuries, the Geniza absorbed the life of the surrounding community, Cairo's Fustat, one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the medieval world. When Schechter and local assistants began removing the manuscripts, they realized the scale of the task. The papers were layered thick with dust, some disintegrating at the touch. They filled crates with what they could safely transport and shipped them to Cambridge University, where the collection still forms the core of the Taylor-Schechter Geniza Research Unit. Other fragments were distributed among libraries in Oxford, New York and Jerusalem. The contents revealed not only sacred writings, but the daily pulse of an entire society. There were letters from traders of the Cairo Geniza merchants, who ran networks linking Egypt, India, Yemen and Spain. Some letters mentioned spices, textiles, and ships caught in storms on the Indian Ocean. Others record disputes over dowries, the hiring of teachers, or the sale of slaves. There are fragments of the Talmud, liturgical poetry, and philosophical treatises by Maimonides, who himself lived and taught in Fustat in the 12th century. One remarkable letter describes the arrival of refugees from North Africa fleeing persecution. Another recounts a failed business venture, written in a tone of exhaustion and humour. A child's school exercises appear on the back of a legal document. Even scraps of cloth and shoe soles used to reinforce bindings carry traces of ink. The Geniza preserved the mundane alongside the sacred, making no distinction between Holy Scripture and a grocery list, as long as it contained writing that once held meaning. The fragments also reveal how intertwined Jewish, Muslim and Christian lives were in medieval Egypt. Many letters are written partly in Arabic but using Hebrew characters, reflecting a world where cultures mix daily. Contracts reference Islamic courts, others record dealings with Christian traders. This fusion of languages and ideas makes the Geniza a living record of coexistence along the medieval trade routes. Physically, the manuscripts vary from fine parchment scrolls to scraps of paper the size of a hand. Some still bear traces of colour and gold from illuminated Bibles, others are little more than ink stains. The climate of Cairo preserved them better than rain ever could. Sealed within the Geniza, away from light and moisture, the papers endured for nearly a millennium. Since their recovery, the fragments have been meticulously catalogued and digitised by the Princeton Geniza Project and the Cambridge University Library, allowing scholars worldwide to piece together texts that once lay buried in dust. Each fragment, whether a prayer or a personal note, connects to the rhythm of everyday life in medieval Egypt. 1,000 years of memory that survived simply because faith forbade throwing words away. From buried scrolls to sealed caves, these forbidden writings survived war, fire, and time itself. Each one speaks from the past with a quiet strength, proof that words, once written, never truly die.